The Texas sun beat mercilessly upon the weathered barn where Colonel Frank Iron Thunder Harrington toiled in solitude. At 62, his broad shoulders still carried the strength that had once commanded the most fearsome armored division in Desert Storm. Sweat glistened on his furrowed brow as he wrestled with the ancient tractor's carburetor. Hands that once guided the most advanced weapon systems in the world, now finding purpose in the simple mechanics of farm equipment. The tractor had belonged to his father, a World War II tank commander himself. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. Two generations of Harringtons, both ending their military careers to return to the land. The difference was his father had returned in glory. Frank had slipped away amid whispers and classified reports. His weathered hands froze when the satellite phone rang. Nobody called that number anymore. Nobody except the Pentagon. Frank wiped his hands on a rag and crossed the barn, boots heavy on the wooden planks. The phone continued its insistent chirp, like a warning klaxon from another life. He stared at it for 3 full rings before answering. Harrington. Colonel, this is General William Davis. The voice sent Frank 30 years into the past. Young Lieutenant Davis, fresh from West Point, scared out of his mind as Iraqi T-72s approached their position outside Khmer. The same Lieutenant Davis who had watched Frank make the hardest decision of his career. A decision that haunted his dreams to this day. It's been a long time, Bill, Frank said, his voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of his pulse. Last I heard, you had 2 stars on your shoulder. 3 now, Colonel. Time waits for no man. Seems to have treated you well enough, Frank replied, leaning against his workbench. What can I do for the United States Army? I've been retired for 15 years. There was a pause, the kind of pause that preceded life-altering moments. Frank had heard it before the order to advance into the Republican Guard's flank, before the news that his wife couldn't handle another deployment and had filed for divorce. We need you back, Frank. One last mission, not in the field, but your expertise, your unique perspective. Frank closed his eyes. He had built a life here on these 200 acres. A simple life, a quiet life, the kind where the only decisions he made were which fields to plant and when to repair the fence line. No lives hung in the balance. No young men waited on his command to charge into enemy fire. I'm done with all that, Bill. You know why I left. This isn't about Khmer, Frank. This is about the future, the next generation. Frank felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders. The weight of responsibility that never truly left, no matter how many years passed, no matter how much distance he put between himself and the battlefield. What exactly are we talking about here? Project Chimera, the Army's next generation main battle tank program. We're down to 2 prototypes and we need someone who understands armored warfare at a bone-deep level. Someone who's been in the fire. Frank's gaze drifted to the wall where his Silver Star hung beside a faded photograph. 8 men in desert camouflage standing proudly in front of an M1A1 Abrams tank. 6 of them never came home. Not in one piece, anyway. There are plenty of tank commanders out there, Bill. Younger men, men without my baggage. None who faced down and destroyed 12 T-72s in a single engagement. None who understand the psychological aspect of commanding 35 tons of steel in a battlefield where a single mistake means death. We need you, Frank. Your country needs you. Frank walked to the barn door, pushing it open to gaze across his land. Fields of corn swayed in the breeze, a stark contrast to the desert landscapes where he'd earned his reputation. He'd promised himself he was done. That chapter closed. But a soldier never truly hangs up his duty, does he? Send a car. I'll listen to what you have to say. No promises beyond that. The line went silent for a moment before Davis responded, relief evident in his voice. Thank you, Colonel. Transport will arrive at 0600 tomorrow. Pack for a week at the Pentagon. After hanging up, Frank stood motionless, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. He'd spent 15 years trying to forget Khmer, 15 years trying to outrun the decisions made in the heat of battle, and now the past had found him again. That night, sleep eluded him. Instead, he found himself in the small room he called his office, staring at the locked cabinet in the corner. With reluctant resolve, he retrieved the key from behind a picture frame and opened it. Inside lay his dress uniform, still impeccably pressed despite the years. Beside it, a leather-bound journal, his war diary. The truth of Khmer documented in his own hand, never shared with the investigation or the press. Some truths were too heavy for others to bear. His fingers brushed across the uniform's fabric, feeling the weight of the metals pinned to the chest. Each one a story, each one a memory, each one a burden. Frank Harrington was going back to war. A different kind of war, perhaps, but war nonetheless. And he knew from bitter experience that in war, there were always casualties. Chapter 2. Project Chimera. The Pentagon hadn't changed. The same labyrinthine corridors, the same fluorescent lighting, the same sense of power concentrated within concrete walls. Frank's civilian clothes, the simple Oxford shirt and khaki pants he'd chosen, marked him as an outsider. Yet the senior officers they passed still nodded with respect. His reputation preceded him. General Davis had aged well. The young lieutenant's boyish face had transformed into the chiseled countenance of command, silver hair cropped in the same military precision he'd always valued. But Frank still saw flashes of that terrified young officer when Davis smiled. The program's been running for 5 years, Davis explained as they walked. $2 billion invested so far. We started with 8 design concepts and narrowed it down to 2 finalists. Both are revolutionary in their own way. Both have passionate advocates within the Defense Department. They reached a secure conference room where 2 aides waited with tablets and coffee. Frank declined the coffee, but accepted the tablet, quickly scanning through the security protocols before pressing his thumb to the biometric scanner. "Welcome to Project Chimera, Colonel Harrington," the male aide said, a young captain with the intelligence branch insignia. "All materials are classified top secret. No electronic devices beyond this point." Frank nodded, surrendering his phone before following Davis through another set of security doors. Beyond lay a command center humming with activity. Large screens displayed technical specifications and simulation results. Officers and civilians huddled around workstations, engaged in animated discussions. Davis led him to a central holographic display where 2 tank models rotated slowly in the air, rendered in perfect detail. "Meet the future of American armored warfare," Davis said with unmistakable pride. On the left, the XM-1 Phoenix, designed and developed entirely domestically by American Defense Systems. On the right, the XK-2 Thunderbolt, based on a modified Leopard 2A8 chassis with American weapon systems and electronics. Frank studied both models carefully, his experienced eye noting the differences in silhouette, gun placement, and armor configuration. "The Phoenix is lighter, faster," Davis continued, "sacrifices some armor protection for speed and maneuverability. The Thunderbolt is heavier, more traditional in approach. Better protection, particularly against top attack munitions, but less agile." Frank circled the display, mentally calculating firing angles, blind spots, crew positions. "What's their primary mission profile?" "That's part of the debate," Davis admitted. "The threat landscape has changed. We're looking at near-peer conflict scenarios against adversaries with sophisticated anti-tank capabilities. Drone swarms, top attack munitions, urban combat. The disagreement centers on whether speed and network systems trump traditional armor in modern warfare." Frank nodded, still examining the holographic models. "Who are the team leaders?" Davis hesitated almost imperceptibly. "The Phoenix team is led by Dr. Viktor Kozlov, brilliant engineer, 20 patents to his name, formerly with DARPA." Frank's head snapped up at the name. "Kozlov? Viktor Kozlov is leading this project?" The tension in the room thickened. Davis met his gaze steadily. "Yes, I'm aware of your history." "History is a polite way of putting it," Frank said coldly. "The man tried to destroy my career at West Point, nearly succeeded too." The memories flooded back. 1983, West Point. Frank was an instructor in tactical operations while Kozlov led the engineering department. Their philosophies had clashed repeatedly, Kozlov believing technology could solve every battlefield problem, Frank insisting that the human element remained paramount. The academic dispute had turned personal when Kozlov accused Frank of sabotaging his experimental tank targeting system during field tests. The investigation had cleared Frank, but the animosity had never dissipated. "Victor has mellowed with age," Davis said, though his tone lacked conviction. "And the Thunderbolt team?" Dr. Sarah Mitchell, MIT, specializes in materials science and ballistic protection systems. Brilliant in her own right, though less experienced with actual battlefield applications. Frank absorbed this information, studying the Thunderbolt's design more carefully now. There was something about the armor configuration that spoke to real-world experience, despite Davis's comments about Mitchell's background. "What exactly do you want from me, Bill? I'm not an engineer." Davis motioned for the room to clear. Staff filed out silently until only the 2 men remained. "We need an objective evaluation from someone who's actually commanded tanks in combat, Someone who understands that theoretical performance metrics don't always translate to battlefield realities. The selection committee is deadlocked. Engineers favor the Phoenix. Field commanders lean toward the Thunderbolt. $2 billion in the lives of countless future tank crews hang in the balance. Frank ran his hand along the edge of the holographic display, watching the light shimmer through his fingers. Why me, specifically? There are other tank commanders with combat experience. Davis's expression hardened. Because you've faced the worst-case scenario and lived to tell about it. Khmer wasn't just another engagement, Frank. It was the most lopsided armor victory in modern warfare. Outgunned, outnumbered, you still prevailed. At what cost? Frank asked quietly. At terrible cost, Davis acknowledged. But that's precisely why you're the right person. You understand the consequences when technology fails, when theory meets reality. And unlike most of the brass giving input, you have no stake in the defense contracting game. No post-retirement job waiting at Raytheon or Lockheed. Frank turned away, staring at the wall of monitors displaying test results and simulation data. He'd spent 15 years trying to leave the war behind. Now they were asking him to step back into that world, if only from the sidelines. How long would this evaluation take? 1 month. You'd observe field tests at the National Training Center, review combat simulations, interview both design teams, and provide a final recommendation. Frank thought of his farm. The crops would survive a month without him. His neighbor Jim could keep an eye on the place. I want complete access, no restricted areas, no sanitized demonstrations. I want to see these machines at their worst, not just their best. And I drive them myself. Davis smiled. I figured you'd say that, already cleared with both teams. Though Kozlov wasn't thrilled. I bet he wasn't. Frank turned back to the holographic tanks, studying them with renewed interest. 1 month, then I go back to my tractors and cornfields. Agreed. Frank extended his hand and Davis shook it firmly. The weight on Frank's shoulders grew heavier, the ghosts of Khmer stirring in the recesses of his memory. One last thing, Frank said. I want all the classified files on Khmer declassified for my review. The complete record. Davis's expression flickered with surprise, then concern. Those files were sealed for good reason, Frank. Opening them now. Those are my terms, Frank interrupted. I need to know what the official record says happened that day, all of it. After a long moment, Davis nodded. I'll see what I can do. But Frank, are you sure you want to revisit that? Frank thought of the nightmares, the faces of the men lost under his command, the decisions made in the chaos of battle. No, he answered honestly, but I think I need to. As they exited the secure room, Frank caught sight of a man watching from the observation deck above. Even at a distance, he recognized Viktor Kozlov. Older now, hair silver at the temples, but with the same intense gaze that had once accused Frank of professional sabotage. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, decades of animosity compressed into a single glance. The battle for Project Chimera had already begun. Chapter 3. Return to the battlefield. The Black Hawk helicopter thundered over the Mojave Desert, its rhythmic thumping a soundtrack Frank hadn't heard in 15 years. Below them stretched the vast expanse of the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, 1,200 square miles of terrain designed to simulate battlefields from around the world. Urban combat facilities, mountain ranges, desert plains where generations of American soldiers had trained for war. Frank gazed out the window, memories washing over him. He'd commanded OPFOR here, Operation Opposing Force, the units tasked with playing enemy combatants to test American battle tactics. Those had been good years, before Khmer, before the ghosts. The helicopter banked sharply toward a cluster of temporary structures near the central testing grounds. As they descended, Frank spotted 2 vehicles under camouflage netting, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable, even covered. The Phoenix and the Thunderbolt, waiting for their trial by fire. A welcoming committee stood on the landing pad. Frank recognized the ramrod straight posture of Viktor Kozlov even before seeing his face. Beside him stood a woman Frank assumed was Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Several officers and technicians completed the group, all squinting against the dust kicked up by the helicopter's rotors. "Welcome to Fort Irwin, Colonel," a young captain shouted over the dying engine noise as Frank disembarked. "I'm Captain Reynolds, your liaison for the duration of the tests." Frank shook the offered hand. "Good to be back, Captain, though I never expected to return." The captain led him toward the waiting group. Viktor Kozlov stepped forward, his face a careful mask of professional courtesy that did nothing to disguise the coldness in his eyes. "Colonel Harrington, it's been, 20 years? 22, Frank corrected, accepting Kozlov's handshake with equal professional detachment. You've done well for yourself, Doctor. From theoretical engineering to leading the most expensive weapons program in the Army's history. Kozlov's smile didn't reach his eyes. And you went from commanding tanks to commanding corn stalks. Life takes us on unexpected journeys. Before Frank could respond, Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, offering her hand. Colonel Harrington, I'm Sarah Mitchell. It's an honor to meet you. Your tactical approach during Operation Desert Storm is still taught at War College. Frank studied her as they shook hands. Mid-40s, confident posture, intelligent eyes that assessed him just as carefully as he evaluated her. There was something vaguely familiar about her face that he couldn't place. Dr. Mitchell, I've been reviewing your work on the Thunderbolt. Impressive armor configuration. Reminds me of lessons we learned the hard way in Iraq. She nodded, pleased by his observation. That's exactly the inspiration. We analyze combat damage reports from Desert Storm and subsequent conflicts. The Thunderbolt's protection system is designed specifically to address vulnerabilities identified in those engagements. Kozlov interjected smoothly, while the Phoenix incorporates active protection systems that make such heavy passive armor obsolete. Why carry tons of steel when you can neutralize incoming threats before impact? And there it was, the philosophical divide at the heart of Project Chimera. Mitchell's approach embraced traditional armor enhanced by modern materials science. Kozlov's vision relied on electronic countermeasures and speed. The eternal debate between protection and avoidance, between absorbing punishment and avoiding it altogether. I look forward to seeing both approaches demonstrated, Frank said diplomatically. When do we begin? Tomorrow morning, Captain Reynolds answered. Today is for briefings and orientation. If you'll follow me, sir, we have quarters prepared for you. As they walked toward the command center, Frank found Mitchell falling into step beside him. I've studied your career extensively, Colonel, she said, particularly your command decisions at Medina Ridge and Khmer. Frank kept his expression neutral, despite the mention of Khmer. Medina Ridge is public record. Khmer is largely classified. Yes, but the outcomes aren't. Your unit destroyed 12 Iraqi tanks without losing a single Abrams. That's unheard of, even with technological superiority. Frank stopped walking, turning to face her directly. We lost men at Khmer, Doctor. The fact that the tanks remained operational doesn't mean there weren't casualties. She had the grace to look abashed. Of course, I apologize for the oversimplification. What I meant was that your tactical approach maximized protection for your vehicles and crew under impossible circumstances. That's the philosophy behind the Thunderbolt. Frank nodded, resuming their walk. And what's the philosophy behind your interest in my career specifically, Dr. Mitchell? There are other tank commanders with impressive records. She hesitated, something flashing behind her eyes that Frank couldn't quite identify. Professional admiration, Colonel, nothing more. He didn't believe her. There was something personal in her interest, but he decided not to press the issue yet. They had a month together. The truth would emerge eventually. The command center was a marvel of modern military technology. Screens displayed real-time data from every corner of the testing grounds. Satellite imagery, drone feeds, environmental conditions, all monitored continuously. In the center of the main room stood a large tactical table displaying a three-dimensional map of the test area. Tomorrow's program, Captain Reynolds explained, bringing up a detailed schedule on the main screen. 0800, technical briefings from both teams. 0930, static inspections of both vehicles. 1100, initial mobility tests on prepared courses. 1400, live fire exercises at the range. 1600, debrief and planning for day 2. Frank scanned the schedule, noting with approval the comprehensive nature of the planned evaluations. I want to personally operate both vehicles after the demonstration runs, he said. Not on a prepared course, real terrain, unpredictable conditions. Kozlov frowned. With all due respect, Colonel, these are prototype systems worth hundreds of millions. The insurance requirements alone, already cleared with the Pentagon, Frank interrupted. I don't just need to see what these machines can do in optimal conditions with trained test crews. I need to know how they respond to the unexpected, how they feel in the hands of someone encountering them for the first time. The Colonel's request is reasonable, Mitchell said, surprising Frank with her support. The Thunderbolt team has no objections. We want an authentic evaluation. Kozlov's expression tightened, but he nodded curtly. Very well. The Phoenix team will also accommodate the Colonel's request. After the briefing concluded, Frank was shown to his quarters, a Spartan but comfortable suite in the officers' section of the base. As the door closed behind him, he finally had a moment alone to process the day's events. He unpacked methodically, military precision ingrained through decades of service, shirts folded perfectly, toiletries arranged by frequency of use. The ritual calmed him, provided order amid the emotional turbulence of returning to this world. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Opening it, he found a junior officer holding a sealed folder. "Priority delivery from the Pentagon, sir. General Davis sent this via secure courier." Frank accepted the folder, noting the top-secret classification stamps. "Thank you, Lieutenant." Alone again, he broke the seal and removed the contents. The complete Khmer file, declassified as he'd requested, the official record of the darkest day of his military career. He poured himself a glass of water, settled into the desk chair, and began to read. The dry, clinical language of the after-action report belied the chaos and horror of that day. Troop movements, engagement protocols, ammunition expenditures, casualty reports. 6 men lost, 6 families shattered, 6 letters Frank had written personally, trying to explain the unexplainable. The report contained everything except the truth. Frank closed the folder after an hour of reading. The official version matched what he'd testified during the investigation: a surprise engagement with superior enemy forces, brilliant tactical maneuvering resulting in complete destruction of enemy armor, unfortunate casualties due to enemy fire. What the report didn't mention was the real reason for those casualties: the split-second decision Frank had made that saved the majority of his command but condemned those 6 men. A decision he'd carried like a physical weight for 15 years. Another knock pulled him from his dark memories. This time it was Victor Kozlov. "May I come in, Colonel? I believe we have matters to discuss before tomorrow's circus begins." Frank gestured for him to enter, closing the folder and sliding it into a drawer. "I figured you might pay me a visit." Kozlov remained standing, hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that reminded Frank of their West Point days. "I want to be clear about something. I don't like you. I never have. I believe you sabotaged my work 22 years ago, regardless of what the investigation concluded. Straight to the point. I've always appreciated that about you, Victor. But," Kozlov continued, "I respect your combat experience, and I want this evaluation to be fair. The Phoenix is the superior platform. I'm confident of that. All I ask is that you judge it on its merits, not on our personal history." Frank studied the man before him. Kozlov had aged, but the intensity remained unchanged. The brilliant, arrogant engineer who believed technology could solve every problem, eliminate every risk. "I have no intention of letting personal feelings interfere with my assessment, Doctor. That's not why I'm here." Kozlov nodded sharply. "Good, then I'll see you tomorrow morning." As he turned to leave, Frank called after him. "Victor, the incident at West Point, I didn't sabotage your targeting system." Kozlov paused at the door. "The evidence suggested otherwise." "Evidence can be misleading. Your system failed because it relied too heavily on perfect conditions. Battlefield conditions are never perfect." Kozlov's shoulders stiffened. "The Phoenix won't fail, Colonel. Not like the Abrams did at Khmer." The reference to Khmer sent ice through Frank's veins. "What exactly do you know about Khmer?" Kozlov smiled thinly. "More than what's in that folder you were reading. Good night, Colonel." After Kozlov left, Frank stood at the window, staring out at the desert night. In the distance, he could see the silhouettes of the 2 prototype tanks under their protective coverings, like sleeping beasts waiting for morning. Tomorrow they would awaken. Tomorrow the past and future would collide, and Frank Harrington would once again be caught in the middle, making decisions that could cost lives. Some things never changed. Chapter 4, Clash of Titans. Dawn at Fort Irwin painted the desert in hues of gold and amber, the rising sun casting long shadows across the testing grounds. Frank stood on the observation platform, watching the first light touch the 2 uncovered prototypes positioned side by side on the staging area. Even at rest, the tanks projected power. The XM-1 Phoenix gleamed with a predatory sleekness, its lower profile and angular surfaces designed to minimize radar signature. The XK-2 Thunderbolt, by contrast, presented a more imposing silhouette, its reinforced turret and layered armor speaking to its defensive philosophy. Frank sipped his coffee as technicians swarmed around both vehicles, performing final checks before the day's evaluations began. The familiar pre-battle routines brought a rush of memories he both welcomed and feared. "Impressive, aren't they?" Frank turned to find Sarah Mitchell beside him, her own gaze fixed on the Thunderbolt. The early light softened her features, revealing the dedication etched in the fine lines around her eyes. They certainly looked the part, Frank acknowledged, but looks don't stop anti-tank rounds. She smiled, appreciating his pragmatism. No, they don't. That's why the Thunderbolt has 3 layers of composite armor, plus reactive panels and an active protection system as backup. We designed it to survive multiple hits from current and projected future weapons. Frank studied her profile. That nagging sense of familiarity returned. You seem personally invested in crew survival, Dr. Mitchell. Most engineers I've known focus on performance metrics. Her expression shifted subtly. Engineering without human context is just mathematics, Colonel. Tanks aren't just weapons platforms. They're protective shells for the humans inside them. Before Frank could probe further, Captain Reynolds approached with the day's final schedule. We're ready to begin when you are, sir. The technical briefings took place in a command trailer positioned between the 2 prototype staging areas. Frank sat between the 2 teams, acutely aware of the tension radiating from both sides as each presented their design philosophy and capabilities. Kozlov spoke first, his presentation a masterpiece of technological confidence. The Phoenix's specifications were impressive: a 120mm smoothbore gun with advanced fire control systems, lightweight composite armor, augmented by an active protection system capable of defeating incoming projectiles, a hybrid electric drive providing both speed and stealth capabilities when needed. The Phoenix represents a paradigm shift in tank warfare, Kozlov concluded. It doesn't need to withstand direct hits because it avoids them entirely. Its sensor suite detects threats at twice the range of current systems. Its networked battle management connects with drones and other assets to identify and eliminate threats before they become imminent. It is, in essence, a tank that refuses to fight on the enemy's terms. Next came Mitchell's presentation on the Thunderbolt. Her approach emphasized resilience and reliability. The Thunderbolt featured thicker armor, particularly on the top surfaces to counter the growing threat of aerial attack. Its power plant was a traditional but refined diesel engine, proven reliable in extreme conditions. The weapon systems were similar to the Phoenix in capability, but with greater ammunition storage. The Thunderbolt acknowledges battlefield reality, Mitchell said, her voice steady with conviction. No matter how advanced our technology, tanks will be targeted. They will be hit. When that happens, crew survival becomes paramount. Our philosophy is simple: tanks should fight and survive, not just avoid and evade. The philosophical gulf between the 2 approaches couldn't have been clearer. As the presentations concluded, Frank found himself mentally cataloging questions for the field tests. Theories and specifications were meaningful, but only performance under stress would reveal the truth. Let's move to the practical evaluations, Frank said, rising from his seat. I want to see these machines in action. The day progressed through a series of increasingly demanding tests. Basic mobility trials demonstrated the Phoenix's superior speed and acceleration, though the Thunderbolt showed remarkable stability over rough terrain. Weapons testing revealed comparable accuracy at range, with the Phoenix's fire control system providing slightly faster target acquisition. By mid-afternoon, both prototypes had performed admirably in controlled conditions. Now came the moment Frank had been waiting for: his personal evaluation. He approached the Phoenix first, climbing the access ladder to the turret as Kozlov watched nervously from below. The interior was a revelation: a spacious, ergonomically designed fighting compartment with screens replacing traditional viewports. The commander's station featured a 360-degree awareness system that eliminated blind spots. Frank settled into the seat, muscle memory from thousands of hours in tanks, guiding his hands to the controls, despite the novel configuration. The interface is intuitive, Kozlov explained from the ground, his voice coming through the communication system. The AI assists with target identification and prioritization. Simply approve its recommendations with the trigger control. Frank methodically worked through the systems, testing response times, checking blind spots, evaluating the feel of the controls. The Phoenix was responsive, almost too responsive, making small adjustments with hair-trigger precision that would challenge crews in high-stress situations. After 30 minutes in the Phoenix, Frank emerged with a thoughtful expression. Kozlov waited expectantly, but Frank merely nodded and moved toward the Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt's interior presented a different philosophy. While still incorporating advanced technology, it maintained some traditional elements that would feel familiar to crews transitioning from current Abrams tanks. The commander's station balanced digital displays with physical backups, an acknowledgement that electronics could fail under battlefield conditions. Mitchell stood at the access ladder. "We prioritize system redundancy," she explained, as Frank explored the controls. "Every critical function has a manual backup. The armor protection means you have time to fall back to secondary systems if primary ones are compromised." Frank tested the manual override for the turret rotation, feeling the reassuring mechanical connection. The Thunderbolt felt solid, substantial, less nimble than the Phoenix, but with a sense of durability that inspired confidence. After completing his initial evaluation of both tanks, Frank gathered the teams for his next request. "Now I want to see them under stress, real-world conditions, a simulated engagement with current generation opposing forces." Kozlov frowned. "Colonel, these are prototypes. They haven't been fully hardened for combat simulation. If they can't handle a simulation, they certainly can't handle actual combat," Frank replied firmly. "Captain Reynolds, can you arrange for 2 OP-4 units from the resident battalion? Current-gen Abrams as opposition." Reynolds nodded. "Yes, sir. We can have them ready in 1 hour at the northern test range." "Good, Dr. Kozlov, Dr. Mitchell, select your best crews. 1 hour." As the teams dispersed to prepare, Frank noticed Sarah Mitchell watching him with an unreadable expression. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. And then that she didn't look on. "You're pushing them hard, Colonel." "War pushes harder, Doctor. Better to find weaknesses here than on the battlefield." She nodded slowly. "I agree, but I suspect you have specific scenarios in mind, something from your experience that you want to test." Frank studied her carefully. "You've done your homework on me, Dr. Mitchell." "Yes, I have specific concerns based on combat experience. Concerns that don't always appear in engineering parameters." "Come here," she said quietly. The name hung in the air between them like smoke. Frank felt his jaw tighten. "What exactly is your interest in Khmer, Doctor? You've mentioned it twice now." She hesitated, conflict evident in her expression. "Professional interest, as I said before. It represents a scenario where American armor was tested to its limits. The lessons from that engagement inform much of the Thunderbolt's design." Frank didn't believe her, but he recognized the wall she'd put up. Whatever her personal connection to Khmer, she wasn't ready to share it. "Then let's see how well those lessons were learned," he said finally. The simulated engagement took place in a valley flanked by rocky outcroppings, ideal terrain for defensive positions and ambushes. Frank observed from a command Humvee positioned on higher ground, alongside Captain Reynolds and representatives from both teams. The scenario was simple but demanding. Each prototype would advance through the valley independently, facing 2 current-generation Abrams tanks in defensive positions. Success would be measured by mission completion, damage avoidance, and tactical effectiveness. The Phoenix went first, moving with impressive speed through the valley, its lower profile making it a difficult target. When the OP-4 tanks opened fire with simulation rounds, the Phoenix's active protection system successfully intercepted the first volley. Its countermeasure suite identified the enemy positions immediately, and its main gun delivered precision fire that neutralized one opponent. But as the engagement progressed, Frank noticed something concerning. The Phoenix's reliance on electronic systems created vulnerability when the second OP-4 tank deployed smoke and infrared countermeasures. Momentarily confused, the Phoenix took a simulated hit that, in real combat, would have been catastrophic. "The system recalibrated and adapted," Kozlov insisted as the exercise concluded. "In a real scenario, the backup systems would have engaged." Frank made notes without commenting, reserving judgment until both evaluations were complete. The Thunderbolt followed a different approach to the same scenario. Moving more deliberately, it used terrain for cover, rather than relying primarily on speed and electronic countermeasures. When engaged by the OP-4 tanks, it absorbed the first simulated hit on its frontal armor, which would have damaged but not destroyed a real tank, and returned fire with methodical precision. Most importantly, when electronic countermeasures temporarily disrupted its primary systems, the crew seamlessly transitioned to backup targeting methods and maintained combat effectiveness. By the end of the scenario, the Thunderbolt had neutralized both OP-4 targets and completed the mission, despite taking a hit that would have required later repair. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Frank gathered both teams for a preliminary debrief. Both prototypes demonstrated impressive capabilities. He began diplomatically. The Phoenix's speed and electronic warfare suite are revolutionary. The Thunderbolt's durability and system redundancy are equally noteworthy. He paused, making eye contact with both team leaders. But today's exercises revealed concerns that will require further evaluation. The Phoenix's performance degraded significantly when its electronic systems were compromised. The Thunderbolt sacrificed mobility for protection, potentially limiting tactical options in fluid battlefield situations. Kozlov's expression darkened. The Phoenix's momentary vulnerability was an anomaly that would be addressed in the production models. Perhaps, Frank acknowledged, but battlefield experience teaches us that anomalies become the norm under fire. Tomorrow, I want to see how both tanks perform against more modern threats, specifically drone swarms and top-attack munitions. The request visibly unsettled both teams. Such threats represented the cutting edge of anti-tank warfare, precisely the scenarios these next-generation tanks needed to counter. "We'll be ready," Mitchell said, her confidence apparently unshaken. Kozlov merely nodded, his jaw set in determination. As the teams dispersed to prepare for the next day's challenges, Frank remained at the observation point, watching the sun set over the desert. The day's evaluations had confirmed some of his suspicions while raising new questions. The sound of approaching footsteps broke his contemplation. Viktor Kozlov stood beside him, gazing out at the darkening landscape. "You're looking for something specific, aren't you?" Kozlov asked without preamble. "Some fatal flaw you believe exists in modern tank design?" Frank considered his response carefully. "I'm looking for truth, Victor. The kind that only emerges under stress. Like at Khmer." Frank turned to face him directly. "What exactly do you think you know about Khmer that isn't in the official record?" Kozlov's smile was thin. "I know that the official record is incomplete. I know 6 men died not because of enemy fire, but because of system failure. The question that haunts me is whether their commander could have prevented those deaths with different decisions." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Frank felt rage building beneath his carefully maintained exterior. "Be very careful, Victor. You're treading on ground you don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Kozlov replied, unintimidated. "I've studied the technical data from those Abrams tanks. The damage patterns, the system logs, they tell a different story than your after-action report." Frank stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Those men were under my command. Their deaths are on my conscience every single day. Don't presume to use their sacrifice as a weapon in your corporate war." "This isn't about corporate interest," Kozlov insisted. "It's about ensuring the next generation of tank crews don't face the same impossible choices you did." The Phoenix represents a fundamental shift away from the philosophy that cost those men their lives. Before Frank could respond, Captain Reynolds approached, unaware of the tension between the two men. "Colonel, there's a secure call for you from General Davis. He's requesting an update." Frank nodded sharply, grateful for the interruption before he said something he might regret. "I'll take it immediately." As he walked away, Kozlov called after him. "We'll continue this discussion another time, Colonel." Frank didn't turn back. The ghosts of Khmer seemed closer tonight than they had in years, whispering accusations that echoed Kozlov's insinuations. 6 men lost, 6 lives cut short, and the truth of how and why buried beneath layers of classified reports and carefully constructed narratives. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new challenges for the competing tanks. But the real test was for Frank himself, whether he could face the past he'd been running from for 15 years, and finally make peace with the decisions made in the crucible of combat. As darkness fell completely over Fort Irwin, the 2 prototype tanks sat silent and watchful, metal sentinels awaiting the dawn. Like the men who built them and the men who would one day command them, they were designed for war, yet untested by its ultimate challenges. Tomorrow would bring them one step closer to that reality. And Frank Harrington, once called Iron Thunder for his unflinching command in the face of overwhelming odds, would be their judge. Morning at Fort Irwin arrived with an ominous sky. Darkening clouds gathered on the horizon, unusual for the desert, as if nature itself recognized the gravity of the day's trials. Frank stood on the command platform, watching technicians make final adjustments to both prototypes below. Today would push these machines beyond their comfort zones, beyond the parameters their creators had optimized for. "Weather report says we might get thunderstorms by afternoon," Captain Reynolds said, joining Frank at the railing. "Rare out here. We can postpone if needed." Frank shook his head. "No, the enemy doesn't postpone for weather. Neither do we." The captain nodded understanding. Combat rarely presented ideal conditions. Today's test would focus on modern threats that had transformed armored warfare drone swarms and top attack munitions specifically designed to target a tank's most vulnerable area, its roof. Frank had insisted on realistic scenarios, not the sanitized demonstrations typically shown to evaluation committees. The teams gathered for the morning briefing, tension evident in the strained silence between them. Viktor Kozlov stood apart, reviewing data on his tablet, occasionally glancing at Frank with barely concealed suspicion. Sarah Mitchell huddled with her engineers, making last-minute adjustments to the Thunderbolt's defense systems. Today's evaluation consists of 3 phases, Frank announced when everyone was present. Phase 1, drone detection and countermeasures. Phase 2, top attack munition defense. Phase 3, system resilience under electronic warfare conditions. He paused, looking around the room. These tests will push both prototypes to their limits and possibly beyond. That's intentional. Tanks don't fail in controlled conditions. They fail when multiple systems are stressed simultaneously. Kozlov stepped forward. The Phoenix is designed for precisely these scenarios, Colonel. Its integrated defense suite can handle multiple threat vectors simultaneously. We'll see, Frank replied neutrally. The Thunderbolt team will go first this morning. Dr. Mitchell, are you ready? She nodded confidently. We are, Colonel. The first test took place on an isolated section of the range. The scenario involved a simulated convoy route with a Thunderbolt as escort. Unbeknownst to the crew, a swarm of 30 small reconnaissance drones would approach from multiple vectors, followed by 5 larger attack drones carrying dummy munitions that would register hits without causing actual damage. Frank observed from the command Humvee, monitoring both the external scenario and the internal crew reactions via cameras placed inside the tank. Mitchell stood beside him, her focus intense as her creation faced its trial. The Thunderbolt moved steadily along the designated route, its crew alert but unaware of the specific threat approaching. When the first drones appeared on their sensors, they responded quickly, activating the countermeasure system, a combination of electronic jamming and a newly developed close-range defensive weapon system that fired specialized ammunition designed to neutralize drone swarms. The smaller reconnaissance drones fell quickly, but the attack drones proved more resilient, using terrain masking to approach from multiple angles. One penetrated the defensive perimeter, scoring a simulated hit on the Thunderbolt's turret that would have damaged but not disabled an actual tank in combat. 1 penetration out of 5 attackers, Frank noted, against a threat specifically designed to defeat armored vehicles. Impressive. Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but Frank caught the slight exhale of relief. The armor still protected the crew even after the countermeasures were partially defeated. That's by design, Colonel, defense in depth. Next came the Phoenix's turn. The scenario was identical, though the drone attack patterns were varied to prevent any advantage from the first demonstration. Kozlov watched with supreme confidence as his creation moved into position. The Phoenix detected the drone swarm earlier than the Thunderbolt had, its advanced sensor suite identifying the threat at extreme range. Instead of engaging directly, it employed a sophisticated electronic warfare package, confusing the drone's guidance systems and causing several to crash without firing a shot. But when the attack drones closed in, using a different approach that minimized their electronic signature, the Phoenix's active defense system faltered. 2 penetrations occurred, both registering as critical hits that would have potentially disabled the tank in actual combat. Kozlov's face tightened with displeasure. The production model will have improved countermeasures. This is an identified limitation in the prototype. Frank made notes without commenting. The Phoenix's superior detection capabilities were offset by vulnerabilities in its last-line defense, an all-too-common trade-off in weapons design. The second phase of testing focused on top attack munitions, the shoulder-fired missiles and precision artillery specifically designed to strike a tank's thinner roof armor. Both prototypes would face a simulated barrage from multiple angles, testing not just their defensive systems, but their armor resilience if those systems failed. The Thunderbolt again went first. Its approach emphasized layered defense, a combination of active protection systems to intercept incoming munitions, reactive armor panels to disrupt warhead formation, and thicker composite armor as the final barrier. When the simulated attacks came, the Thunderbolt neutralized most threats, but took 2 hits on its roof armor. Sensors indicated the armor held, though with significant damage that would require repair. Your focus on roof protection is unusual, Frank commented to Mitchell as they reviewed the results. Most designs prioritize frontal armor. She nodded. We studied recent conflicts carefully. The data shows a clear shift toward top attack as the preferred method against modern tanks. Traditional design philosophy hasn't caught up to this reality. The Phoenix took a fundamentally different approach to the same threat. Rather than emphasizing armor, it relied on a combination of signature reduction, making it harder to target in the first place, and an advanced interception system designed to neutralize threats before they reached the tank. When the simulated attack began, the Phoenix's systems worked brilliantly against the first wave, intercepting every incoming munition. But as the attack intensified, the system became overwhelmed. 3 simulated hits penetrated to the armor layer, which, being thinner than the Thunderbolts, registered as catastrophic damage that would have destroyed the tank and killed its crew in actual combat. Kozlov was visibly disturbed by the result. This scenario represents an unrealistic concentration of fire. No tank would face this intensity of attack without support assets. Operation Medina Ridge, Frank replied calmly. My own unit faced 18 T-72s firing near simultaneously. Desert Storm, this isn't theoretical, Doctor. The final phase of the day's evaluation would prove the most revealing. Both tanks would operate in an environment saturated with electronic warfare jamming signals, GPS spoofing, and communication disruption. These conditions simulated the reality of near-peer conflict, where technological advantages could be neutralized by an adversary with sophisticated countermeasures. The Phoenix, so reliant on its network systems and electronic superiority, struggled visibly in this environment. Its targeting accuracy degraded significantly. Navigation became erratic. Most concerning, the crew appeared increasingly frustrated and disoriented, their training insufficient to compensate for systems they had been taught to trust implicitly. The Thunderbolt faced similar electronic challenges, but demonstrated greater resilience. Its redundant systems and manual backups allowed the crew to maintain combat effectiveness even when primary systems were compromised. The philosophy of designing for failure proved its value in conditions specifically created to induce failure. As the day's evaluation concluded, storm clouds had indeed gathered over Fort Irwin. Thunder rumbled in the distance as the teams secured their prototypes and prepared for the debrief. The weather seemed an appropriate metaphor for the tensions building between the competing philosophies. Frank gathered both teams in the command center, where data from the day's test displayed on screens around the room. The contrast between the two approaches had never been clearer, both in their strengths and their vulnerabilities. Both prototypes demonstrated exceptional capabilities today, Frank began diplomatically. The Phoenix's early detection and electronic warfare suite is genuinely revolutionary. The Thunderbolt's layered defense concept and system redundancy proved highly effective against modern threats. He paused, letting his gaze move between Kozlov and Mitchell, but both also revealed critical vulnerabilities. The Phoenix excels when its electronic systems function optimally, but degrades dangerously when those systems are compromised. The Thunderbolt sacrifices mobility and first strike capability for survivability, potentially limiting its offensive applications. Kozlov stepped forward, unable to contain his frustration. With respect, Colonel, you've created artificial scenarios specifically designed to exploit known prototype limitations. The production Phoenix will address these vulnerabilities. Every enemy seeks to exploit vulnerabilities, Frank replied evenly. That's the nature of warfare. The question isn't whether vulnerabilities exist, it's how catastrophic their exploitation becomes. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the room through the windows. The storm was approaching, both literally and figuratively. Tomorrow, Frank continued, I want to see these tanks operated by regular Army crews, not your test teams. I want soldiers with standard training levels, not engineers who help build the systems. Real-world operation by real-world operators. The request clearly unsettled both team leaders. Test crews were intimately familiar with their vehicles, able to compensate for quirks and limitations in ways average soldiers could not. That's not standard protocol for prototype evaluation, Kozlov objected. I'm not conducting a standard evaluation, Frank replied. I'm determining which of these machines I would trust with the lives of American soldiers in combat. That requires understanding how they perform in the hands of those same soldiers. As the meeting concluded and the teams dispersed, Frank found himself alone with the data displays, reviewing footage from both tanks during the day's trials. Something about the Thunderbolt's armor configuration continued to nag at him, a familiarity he couldn't place, despite his extensive experience with armored vehicles. Analyzing our weaknesses, Colonel? Frank turned to find Sarah Mitchell watching him from the doorway. Rain had begun to fall outside, drumming on the metal roof of the command center. Analyzing patterns, he corrected. Your armor design reminds me of something, but I can't place it. She entered the room and approaching the display showing the Thunderbolt schematics, perhaps because it incorporates lessons from multiple sources. Soviet T-90 influenced the turret geometry. Israeli Merkava inspired the powertrain protection, but the layered composite approach. She hesitated. Yes? That was informed by forensic analysis of Abrams tanks damaged in combat, including those at Khamir. Frank's expression remained neutral, but he felt a familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of that name. You seem fixated on Khamir, Dr. Mitchell. I'm beginning to think it's not just professional interest. The rain intensified outside, thunder cracking directly overhead now. Mitchell stared at the schematics, avoiding Frank's gaze. My father was a tank commander, she said finally. He taught me to respect armor, not just as technology, but as protection for the humans inside. Everything I've designed reflects that philosophy. Before Frank could respond, the door opened again. Captain Reynolds entered, soaked from the downpour. Colonel, we've got an urgent message from General Davis. Satellite link in the secure communications room. Frank nodded, holding Mitchell's gaze for a moment longer. There was more to her story than she was sharing, but it would have to wait. We'll continue this conversation later, Doctor. The secure communications room was a windowless space filled with encryption equipment and satellite uplinks. General Davis's face appeared on the screen, the Pentagon visible behind him. Frank, he greeted without preamble. How are the evaluations progressing? Revealing, Frank replied. Both designs have merit. Both have significant weaknesses. Davis nodded, seeming unsurprised. I've received preliminary reports. The committee is particularly interested in your assessment of crew survivability under worst-case scenarios. The Thunderbolt has a clear advantage there. The Phoenix prioritizes avoiding threats over surviving them. Different philosophies for different strategic requirements. Davis leaned forward, his expression turning grave. Frank, there's another dimension to this evaluation I haven't shared until now. Intelligence has identified a new Russian anti-tank system specifically designed to counter our next-generation armor. Project Vanguard. We believe they have developed a networked approach combining electronic warfare, drone swarms, and hypervelocity penetrators. Frank absorbed this information, immediately seeing the implications. The Phoenix would be particularly vulnerable to the electronic warfare component. Precisely, but the Thunderbolt may lack the mobility to evade the physical threats. Neither solution is perfect against this emerging capability. Frank considered this new information. Why tell me this now? Because tomorrow you'll receive classified technical data on Vanguard. I need you to assess both prototypes specifically against this threat. This may be the deciding factor in the final selection. I understand. Davis hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. There's something else. We've detected unusual data traffic between Fort Irwin and an unidentified server in Eastern Europe. Possible intelligence collection. I need you to be cautious about what you share with both teams. The implication was clear. Someone at the test site might be compromised. Frank's mind immediately went to Kozlov, with his Russian heritage and documented grudges. But assumptions were dangerous. The leak could come from anywhere. I'll keep this confidential, Frank assured him. After the call ended, Frank remained in the communications room, processing this new complication. The stakes had just risen considerably. This wasn't just about selecting the better tank design. It was potentially about preventing critical military technology from falling into adversarial hands. The storm continued to rage outside as Frank made his way back to his quarters. The rain seemed appropriate somehow, a cleansing deluge before the more complex challenges ahead. Tomorrow would require not just technical evaluation, but counterintelligence awareness, watching for signs of who might be the security breach. In his room, Frank returned to the Khamir file, searching for something specific. If Sarah Mitchell's father had been a tank commander, his name should appear somewhere in the records of that era. He scanned the personnel listings, looking for anyone with the surname Mitchell. There it was, Captain Robert Mitchell, commander of an Abrams in the 3rd Armored Division during Operation Desert Storm, not in Frank's direct chain of command, but operating in the same theater. Further searching revealed that Captain Mitchell had indeed been present near Khamir, though not directly involved in the engagement that haunted Frank. But the record showed something else. Captain Mitchell had died in Iraq. Not at Khmer specifically, but in the same general time frame. The cause listed was combat-related vehicle malfunction, the vague terminology used when the full circumstances were classified. Frank closed the file, a new hypothesis forming. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just professionally interested in Khmer. She was personally invested because of her father's death. But did she know the full story? Did she blame Frank or the tank design, or both for her loss? Tomorrow would bring not just technical challenges, but human ones. Frank would need to navigate both with equal skill if he hoped to fulfill his mission and perhaps finally confront the ghosts that had haunted him since that fateful day in the Iraqi desert. Chapter 6. Shadows of Khmer. Dawn broke over Fort Irwin with lingering puddles from the night storm, reflecting the orange glow of sunrise. The desert air felt unusually clean, purified by the rare rainfall. Frank stood outside his quarters, watching the early light illuminate the distant mountains, trying to clear his mind for the day ahead. Today's evaluation would involve regular Army crews operating the prototypes, not the specialized test teams who knew every nuance of their respective vehicles. It would be the truest test yet of how these machines would perform in the hands of their intended users. But Frank's thoughts weren't focused entirely on the upcoming tests. The revelation about potential intelligence leaks and Sarah Mitchell's probable connection to Khmer had complicated an already complex mission. Someone at the test site might be compromised. Someone might be using this evaluation for purposes beyond selecting America's next main battle tank. Early riser, Colonel? Frank turned to find Viktor Kozlov approaching, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. The engineer carried 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Frank. Old habits, Frank replied, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. Combat operations typically begin at dawn, the body remembers. They stood in silence for a moment, an unusual truce in their otherwise antagonistic relationship. Kozlov finally broke the quiet. I want to apologize for my tone yesterday. The Phoenix is personal for me, more than a machine. It represents my life's work, my vision for the future of armored warfare. Frank studied the man beside him. Kozlov had aged since their West Point days, but the intensity remained unchanged, burning beneath the surface of professional courtesy. We all have personal investments in this program, Victor. But ultimately, it's not about you or me or any individual's vision. It's about the men and women who will ride these machines into battle. Kozlov nodded slowly, which is why I believe so strongly in the Phoenix's approach. Avoid the hit entirely rather than trying to absorb it. The best armor is not being where the enemy's weapon strikes. It was the fundamental philosophical divide that had separated them for decades. Frank had always believed in preparing for worst-case scenarios. Kozlov believed in creating systems so advanced that worst-case scenarios became theoretical rather than inevitable. Regular Army crews today, Frank said, changing the subject. How do you think they'll handle the Phoenix's advanced interface? A shadow of concern crossed Kozlov's face. We've simplified the training requirements significantly, but there's no denying the learning curve is steeper than with conventional designs. That's my concern, Frank acknowledged. The most sophisticated weapon in history is useless if average soldiers can't operate it effectively under stress. They finished their coffee as the base came alive around them, personnel moving purposefully toward the day's activities. When they parted ways, the momentary connection faded, replaced once more by the tension of competition and old rivalries. At the main testing ground, both prototype tanks stood ready, their exteriors still bearing scuff marks from the previous day's evaluations. Nearby, 2 groups of soldiers received final briefings from their respective design teams. These were experienced tankers drawn from active duty units, but they had never operated these specific vehicles until this morning's abbreviated training session. Frank approached the Thunderbolt crew first, a sergeant, corporal, and 2 specialists with combat tours in the Middle East evident from their service ribbons. How's the familiarization going, Sergeant? Frank asked the crew commander. Honestly, sir, it's like driving a Cadillac after being in a Humvee. The systems are more advanced than our Abrams, but the basic layout is familiar enough. The muscle memory transfers. Frank nodded, encouraged by this assessment. He moved to the Phoenix crew, where the mood seemed more tense, the soldiers' expressions betraying concentration as they tried to absorb the novel control interfaces. Your impressions, Sergeant? Frank asked their leader. The sergeant straightened. It's impressive technology, sir, unlike anything we've trained on before. The automated targeting system is, Well, it's like having another crew member handling half the workload. But, Frank prompted, hearing the reservation in the man's voice. But I'm not entirely sure what to do if those automated systems fail, sir. There seem to be manual backups, but they're not intuitive if you've trained on standard equipment. It confirmed Frank's suspicion. The Phoenix's revolutionary approach created a steeper learning curve that could prove problematic in the chaos of combat, where simplicity and reliability often trump technological sophistication. Today's evaluation would follow a similar structure to the previous day, but with an added dimension of crew performance assessment. How quickly could they adapt? How effectively could they respond to unexpected challenges? How well did the machines accommodate human limitations under stress? The test began with basic maneuver and engagement drills, allowing the crews to become comfortable with their vehicles before introducing more complex scenarios. The Thunderbolt crew adapted quickly, their familiar tank skills transferring naturally to the enhanced platform. The Phoenix crew showed more hesitation, frequently consulting reference materials as they navigated the advanced interface. By mid-morning, they progressed to more demanding scenarios: electronic warfare conditions, multiple simultaneous threats, system failures requiring contingency operations. Throughout it all, Frank observed not just the machine's performance, but the human element, the frustration, adaptation, and occasional moments of brilliance as soldiers grappled with cutting-edge technology. During a break between exercises, Frank found Sarah Mitchell reviewing data from the morning's tests. Her expression showed satisfaction with the Thunderbolt's performance in relatively inexperienced hands. Your design philosophy is paying dividends today, Frank acknowledged. The learning curve is significantly gentler. She nodded, genuine pride evident in her posture. We designed with the human element as our central concern. Technology should serve the operator, not the other way around. Frank recognized an opening to address the questions that had been building since yesterday. That human-centered approach, it comes from personal experience? Her eyes met his, wariness evident. As I mentioned, my father was a tank commander. He taught me to respect the men inside the machine. Captain Robert Mitchell, Frank said carefully, watching her reaction. 3rd Armored Division, Desert Storm. Her expression flickered with surprise, then guarded recognition that Frank had done his research. Yes, he died there. I know, Frank said quietly. I looked him up in the archives after our conversation yesterday. Combat-related vehicle malfunction was the official cause. Sarah's focus shifted to the distant Thunderbolt, where the crew was conducting maintenance checks during the break. That's what the letter said. Never any details beyond that. I was 12 when he died. Frank weighed his next words carefully. The timing and location suggests he may have been near Khmer when it happened. He was, she confirmed, her voice steady despite the emotional subject. My mother received condolence letters from his commanding officer. They mentioned Khmer, though never with any specifics about what happened there. Classified, they said. Frank felt the weight of history and secrets pressing down on him. How much did she know? How much was she seeking through this program? Is that why you're so focused on crew survivability? Because of your father? She turned to face him directly. Wouldn't you be? I dedicated my career to ensuring other children don't receive the same vague letters about their parents dying in vehicle malfunctions. The Thunderbolt isn't just a weapon platform to me, Colonel. It's a promise to every family whose loved ones serve inside these machines. Before Frank could respond, Captain Reynolds approached with a secure tablet. Colonel, the classified briefing materials from General Davis have arrived. You're needed in the secure room. Frank nodded, holding Sarah's gaze for a moment longer. We'll continue this conversation, Dr. Mitchell. In the secure communications room, Frank reviewed the intelligence on Project Vanguard, the Russian next-generation anti-tank system. The details were concerning a sophisticated networked approach that combined electronic warfare, drone swarms, and a new type of hypervelocity penetrator specifically designed to defeat modern composite armor. Most worrying was the electronic warfare component, designed to disrupt the very network systems that gave modern tanks their edge. According to the intelligence assessment, Vanguard could potentially render the Phoenix's advanced systems inoperable, reducing it to a lighter, less armored version of conventional tanks. The Thunderbolt, with its emphasis on redundancy and manual backups, would fare better against the electronic attacks, but might still be vulnerable to the physical penetrators. Frank spent an hour analyzing the threat, comparing it against the specifications of both prototypes. Neither offered a perfect defense, but the Thunderbolt's philosophy of defense in depth seemed better suited to countering a multifaceted threat that specifically targeted technological vulnerabilities. As he prepared to leave the secure room, Frank remembered General Davis's warning about potential intelligence leaks. He would need to incorporate the Vanguard threat into his evaluation without explicitly revealing the classified information, a delicate balance. When he returned to the testing grounds, the afternoon evaluations were already underway. Both crews had progressed to complex tactical scenarios, employing their vehicles in simulated combat against multiple threat types. The performance gap between the two approaches had widened, with the Thunderbolt crew operating with increasing confidence, while the Phoenix crew still struggled with certain aspects of the advanced interface. Frank joined Victor Kozlov, who watched the Phoenix's performance with evident concern. "Your concerns about the learning curve appear justified," the engineer admitted reluctantly. "We may need to simplify certain interfaces for production models." "The fundamental issue isn't the interface," Frank replied. "It's the philosophy. The Phoenix asks its crew to trust systems they don't fully understand and can't manually override in emergencies. Trust is earned in combat, not designed in laboratories." Kozlov's expression hardened. "You're determined to favor the conventional approach, aren't you? Despite the Phoenix's superior capabilities when operating as designed." "I'm determined to select the tank that will bring the most crews home alive," Frank corrected, "even when nothing operates as designed." "Like at Khmer?" Kozlov asked pointedly. Frank turned to face him directly. "What exactly do you think happened at Khmer, Victor? You keep referencing it." Kozlov hesitated, seemingly weighing whether to reveal his knowledge. "I know that your unit suffered catastrophic system failures in your Abrams tanks. Failures that the official record attributes to enemy action, but were actually design flaws. Failures that cost lives." The statement hung in the air between them, too accurate to dismiss, yet incomplete in crucial ways. Frank felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied discussions of Khmer. "You've seen technical reports," Frank acknowledged, "but technical reports don't capture the full reality of what happens in combat." "Perhaps not," Kozlov conceded, "but they do reveal when official narratives are convenient fictions designed to protect reputations and contracts." Before Frank could respond, a commotion from the testing area drew their attention. The Phoenix had stopped mid-exercise, its turret frozen in position. The crew was attempting to restart systems according to emergency procedures, but nothing appeared to be functioning. "Complete system failure," Kozlov muttered, already moving toward the stricken vehicle. "Impossible unless—" Frank followed, his mind racing. This wasn't part of the planned evaluation. Something had gone catastrophically wrong with the Phoenix's electrical systems. By the time they reached the tank, the crew had evacuated, standing helplessly beside the disabled machine. Engineers swarmed around it, attempting to diagnose the problem. "What happened?" Kozlov demanded. "Everything just died, sir," the sergeant explained. "All screens went black simultaneously. Backup power failed to engage. Manual overrides are non-responsive." Kozlov climbed onto the tank, disappearing into the turret. Minutes later, he emerged with a thunderous expression. "The main power distribution node has been physically damaged. This wasn't system failure. This was sabotage." The accusations silenced the gathered personnel. Frank assessed the situation rapidly. If Kozlov was correct, someone had deliberately disabled the Phoenix. Someone with access and technical knowledge. "Secure the area," Frank ordered Captain Reynolds. "No one leaves. I want every maintenance record for the last 24 hours. Every person who had access to this vehicle identified and interviewed." As security personnel moved to implement his orders, Frank pulled Kozlov aside. "Are you certain this was deliberate?" "Without question," Kozlov replied, his voice low and intense. "The damage pattern is inconsistent with electrical failure or combat damage. Someone physically disconnected key systems in a way designed to appear as catastrophic failure." Frank nodded grimly. "The intelligence leak General Davis warned about. Someone isn't just collecting information. They're actively undermining the program." Kozlov's eyes narrowed. "You knew about a security concern and didn't inform me." "I was briefed this morning. No suspects were identified." Frank surveyed the scene, where military police were already establishing a perimeter around the Phoenix. "We need to examine the Thunderbolt as well. If someone sabotaged one prototype—" "They may have sabotaged both," Kozlov finished. "A thorough inspection of the Thunderbolt revealed no signs of tampering, but security protocols were implemented for both vehicles nonetheless. The day's evaluation was suspended pending a preliminary investigation. Frank ordered all personnel restricted to base and established round-the-clock security for both prototypes. As evening approached, he convened a meeting with both team leaders in the secure communications room, away from potential surveillance. What we discuss stays in this room, Frank began without preamble. The Phoenix was sabotaged by someone with technical knowledge and access. The Thunderbolt appears untouched, but we're taking no chances. Starting now, both prototypes require two-person authentication for any maintenance or modifications. Sarah Mitchell appeared genuinely shocked by the sabotage. Who would do this? And why target only the Phoenix? That's what we need to determine, Frank replied. General Davis informed me this morning about unusual data transmissions between Fort Irwin and servers in Eastern Europe. It appears we have a more serious breach than just information gathering. Kozlov's expression darkened. You're suggesting a foreign intelligence operation. Russian, given the Eastern European connection. I'm not making accusations, Frank said carefully, but the timing is suspicious. We've just received intelligence about a new Russian anti-tank system called Vanguard that specifically targets the kind of network capabilities the Phoenix emphasizes. He outlined the Vanguard threat in general terms, careful not to reveal classified details. Both team leaders understood the implications immediately. If Russia believes the Phoenix represents the greater threat to their armor dominance, Sarah began, they might seek to discredit it during evaluation. Kozlov finished, his expression grim, making the Thunderbolt appear more reliable by comparison. Frank nodded. It's one possibility. Another is industrial espionage. Or it could be someone with a personal agenda. At this point, we don't have enough information to determine motive. What about tomorrow's evaluation, Sarah asked. Do we proceed? Yes, but with modified parameters. We focus on security robustness, how well each design resists tampering, hacking, and unauthorized access. The sabotage has inadvertently created a real-world test of system resilience. As the meeting concluded, Frank asked Kozlov to remain behind. When they were alone, he addressed the engineer directly. Victor, given your Russian heritage, you understand this incident puts you in a difficult position. I need to ask you directly, do you have any connection to Russian intelligence or defense contractors? Kozlov's face flushed with anger. You cannot be serious. I've been an American citizen for 30 years. My loyalty has never been questioned. I'm not questioning your loyalty, Frank clarified. I'm establishing baselines. Everyone with access to the prototypes will be asked similar questions. I'm starting with you because you deserve the courtesy of a direct conversation rather than a formal interrogation. Kozlov's anger subsided slightly. No, Colonel, I have no connection to Russian intelligence or defense contractors. My work has always been for American interests exclusively. Frank nodded, accepting the statement. And what about your history with Sarah Mitchell? Did you know her father? Surprise flickered across Kozlov's face. Robert Mitchell, I knew of him. We never met personally. Why do you ask? Because too many connections to Khmer are emerging for coincidence, Frank replied. Mitchell's father died there under classified circumstances. You've repeatedly referenced system failures during that engagement. Now we have sabotage targeting a prototype that emphasizes the same networked approach that reportedly failed at Khmer. Kozlov considered this, his analytical mind clearly processing the connections. You believe the sabotage is related to Khmer after all these years? I don't know, Frank admitted, but I intend to find out. After Kozlov departed, Frank remained in the secure room, reviewing security footage of the maintenance bay where the Phoenix had been stored overnight. The cameras showed normal activity technicians performing routine checks, security personnel conducting patrols. Nothing overtly suspicious. But as Frank studied the footage more carefully, he noticed a brief period when the Phoenix was left unattended. Just 3 minutes when a security patrol was delayed and a maintenance technician stepped away. 3 minutes during which someone could have accessed the tank systems if they moved quickly and knew exactly what they were doing. Frank requested personnel files for everyone with access to the maintenance bay. As he reviewed them, one name caught his attention, a junior technician recently assigned to the program. The background check showed nothing suspicious, but the timing of the assignment, just 3 weeks before the evaluation began, raised questions. He was still reviewing files when Sarah Mitchell knocked on the door of the secure room. Her expression was troubled as she entered. You should see this, she said, placing a tablet on the table. It displayed a technical analysis of the damaged components from the Phoenix. The sabotage was sophisticated, but it left a signature. Whoever did this has extensive knowledge of Russian electronic warfare techniques. These exact methods were used to disable Ukrainian armored vehicles in recent conflicts. Frank studied the report, the implications clear. So we're looking at Russian intelligence involvement. It appears so, Sarah agreed, but that's not why I came to see you. She hesitated, visibly gathering resolve. It's about my father, about Kamir. Frank felt his pulse quicken. What about it? All my life I've been told he died in a vehicle malfunction. Classified circumstances. No details provided. She met Frank's gaze directly. But recently I received an anonymous message suggesting his death wasn't an accident, that it was the result of deliberate decisions made by his commanding officers. Frank maintained his composure, though inwardly he felt the familiar weight of guilt and responsibility. When did you receive this message? 3 weeks ago, just before this evaluation began. The timing aligned with the security concerns too perfectly to be coincidence. Someone was using Sarah's personal connection to Kamir as part of a larger operation. What exactly did this message claim? Frank asked carefully. That my father's tank was sacrificed to protect others. That his systems were remotely disabled to create a diversion that allowed the rest of the unit to outflank the enemy. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes reflected decades of uncertainty. The message said you would know the truth. Frank absorbed this, his mind racing. The allegation contained elements of truth twisted in crucial ways. Someone was manipulating Sarah, using her personal loss as leverage in the current situation. Dr. Mitchell, Frank said carefully, I was at Kamir. I know what happened there. And while I can't discuss classified details, I can tell you that message contains deliberate misinformation designed to manipulate you. How can I believe that? She asked, her professional composure cracking slightly. You have every reason to maintain the official narrative. Because I knew your father, Sarah. Her eyes widened with surprise. You never mentioned that. I wasn't certain until I confirmed it in the records yesterday. But yes, I knew Robert Mitchell. Not well, but we served in the same theater. He was a good man, a good soldier. Frank paused, weighing how much to reveal, and his death was not the result of anyone sacrificing him for tactical advantage. I give you my word on that. Sarah studied his face, searching for deception. Then what really happened? I can't tell you everything. Not yet. But I promise you this, once this evaluation is complete, I will tell you everything I can about what happened to your father. You deserve that truth. She nodded slowly, accepting this compromise. And in the meantime, we need to identify who sent you that message, because they're almost certainly connected to the sabotage. Someone is using your personal history to influence this evaluation. The question is why and to what end? As she turned to leave, Frank added, be careful who you trust, Dr. Mitchell. Someone is playing a very sophisticated game, and they're using your father's memory as a pawn. Left alone again, Frank returned to the personnel files with renewed purpose. The connections were becoming clearer, Kamir. The sabotage, the leaked information about Russian anti-tank systems, the anonymous message to Sarah Mitchell. Someone was orchestrating these elements toward an unknown objective, using decades-old classified incidents as leverage. Tomorrow would be critical, not just for evaluating the competing tank designs, but for uncovering the truth behind the sabotage. Frank had the unsettling feeling that the ghosts of Kamir were returning for reasons far more complex than personal revenge or professional rivalry. As night fell over Fort Irwin, both prototype tanks sat under heavy guard, their competing visions for the future of armored warfare temporarily overshadowed by the very human elements of espionage, manipulation, and decades-old secrets threatening to resurface. The technical evaluation had become something far more dangerous, a game of counterintelligence with American military superiority hanging in the balance. Chapter 7, The Power Game. Morning arrived with a sense of heightened vigilance across Fort Irwin. Additional military police patrolled the perimeter of the test area. Both prototype tanks remained under constant surveillance, each with a 2-person security detail preventing unauthorized access. Frank had slept little, spending most of the night reviewing security protocols and personnel files. By dawn, he had narrowed his list of potential security risks to 3 individuals, all with recent assignments to the program, all with access to the maintenance areas, all with technical skills sufficient to sabotage sophisticated systems. He contacted General Davis via secure line before breakfast, updating him on the situation and requesting deep background checks on the three suspects. Davis promised results within hours and authorized Frank to modify the day's evaluation parameters as needed to address the security concerns. "Find the leak, Frank," Davis instructed gravely. "This program is too important to allow foreign interference. Use whatever resources you need." The morning briefing had a decidedly different tone than previous days. The sabotage incident had created tension among all personnel, with suspicious glances and whispered conversations replacing the usual professional camaraderie. "Today's evaluation focuses on security resilience," Frank announced to the assembled teams. "In light of yesterday's incident, we're shifting our parameters to assess how well each platform resists unauthorized access and tampering." He outlined the modified test's physical security measures, electronic intrusion prevention, and system authentication protocols. Both prototypes would be subjected to simulated attacks by trained cybersecurity specialists from the Army's Digital Warfare Group. "This isn't just about selecting the better tank design anymore," Frank concluded. "It's about ensuring American armored superiority remains secure from outside interference." The evaluation proceeded with methodical precision. The Phoenix, repaired overnight, demonstrated impressive electronic countermeasures against hacking attempts. Its sophisticated systems designed with multiple layers of encryption and access controls. However, its physical security showed weaknesses. Certain components remained accessible without triggering alarms, potentially allowing sabotage similar to yesterday's incident. The Thunderbolt took a different approach to security. Its systems were more compartmentalized, requiring multiple authentication points for critical functions. Physical access to vital components was restricted by mechanical locks, in addition to electronic safeguards, a distinctly old-school approach that nonetheless proved effective against modern threats. Midway through the morning's evaluation, Captain Reynolds approached Frank with a secure tablet. "Message from General Davis, sir, marked urgent." Frank stepped away from the testing area, opening the encrypted communication. Davis had sent preliminary findings on the background investigations. Two of the suspects showed no concerning connections, but the third, a maintenance technician named Paul Reeves, had financial transactions linked to a shell company associated with Russian defense contractors. Not definitive proof of espionage, but certainly cause for immediate action. "Have Reeves discreetly detained for questioning," Frank instructed Reynolds. "No public arrest. I don't want to tip off any potential accomplices." As Reynolds departed to implement the order, Frank's attention was drawn to an unexpected arrival. A black SUV with Pentagon markings had pulled up to the command center. From it emerged a civilian in an expensive suit, flanked by two military officers in dress uniform. "Who authorized additional personnel?" Frank demanded of the nearest security officer. "Orders came directly from the Secretary of Defense, sir." "The civilian is Richard Dalton, Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment. He's here to observe the final phases of evaluation." Frank frowned. High-level observation was not unusual for major defense programs, but the timing following a sabotage incident struck him as suspicious. He approached the delegation as they were being escorted toward the testing area. "Mr. Undersecretary," Frank greeted formally. "Colonel Frank Harrington, I wasn't informed of your visit." Dalton, a slender man with silver hair and calculating eyes, offered a practiced smile. "Colonel Harrington, your reputation precedes you." The secretary felt it important to have direct oversight given the significance of this program and yesterday's unfortunate incident. Frank noted the careful phrasing. "We're still investigating that incident, sir. Security protocols have been enhanced accordingly." "Of course," Dalton replied smoothly. "I've been fully briefed. Please continue with your evaluation. Consider me merely an observer." Something about Dalton's manner raised Frank's instincts. The man projected bureaucratic authority, but beneath it, Frank sensed a sharper purpose. 35 years in the military had taught him to recognize when someone was playing a deeper game than their title suggested. "As you wish, sir. Captain Reynolds will escort you to the observation area. I must ask that you remain within designated zones and avoid interaction with the technical teams during active testing." Dalton nodded agreeably, but as he passed Frank, he spoke quietly. "We should discuss Khmer privately, Colonel. I believe it's relevant to current circumstances." The reference froze Frank momentarily. How many people were suddenly interested in a classified operation from 15 years ago? The connections were multiplying, suggesting a coordinated effort rather than coincidental interest. Frank returned to the evaluation, maintaining his professional demeanor while his mind raced with new concerns. Undersecretary Dalton represented another variable in an already complex equation. If he knew about Khmer, what was his angle? Political, military, or something more personal? The morning's test concluded without further incident, both prototypes demonstrating strengths and weaknesses in their security approaches. During the lunch break, Frank received word that Paul Reeves was being questioned by military intelligence officers. Initial interrogation had revealed concerning connections, but no definitive confession of sabotage. Frank used the break to observe Dalton, who spent his time engaged in intense conversation with Victor Kozlov. The two appeared familiar with each other, suggesting a relationship that predated this evaluation. Another connection to investigate. Sarah Mitchell approached Frank as he monitored the interaction from a distance. The undersecretary's arrival seems oddly timed, she observed. Indeed, Frank agreed, particularly his apparent familiarity with Dr. Kozlov. They've known each other for years, Sarah confirmed. Dalton was on the original committee that approved funding for the Phoenix Project. He's been one of its strongest advocates in Washington. This information added yet another dimension to Frank's growing mental map of connections. If Dalton had a vested interest in the Phoenix's success, his presence immediately following sabotage that had temporarily disabled that prototype raised serious questions. Has he shown similar support for the Thunderbolt? Frank asked. Sarah's expression tightened. Quite the opposite. He's repeatedly questioned our approach as outdated thinking and attempted to redirect funding toward the Phoenix. Only intervention from General Davis and several field commanders kept our project alive. The picture was becoming clearer, a bureaucratic power struggle within the Pentagon, with competing visions for the future of armored warfare. But that still didn't explain the connection to Khmer or the apparent Russian interest in sabotaging the evaluation. Be careful around him, Frank advised. Whatever game is being played here has multiple dimensions. The afternoon evaluation shifted focus to battlefield recovery procedures, how each tank could be retrieved if disabled by enemy action. This aspect of design often received less attention than offensive capabilities. But Frank knew from bitter experience that recovery under fire could mean the difference between losing a vehicle and losing its crew. The Phoenix demonstrated advanced self-diagnostics and remote operation capabilities, potentially allowing a damaged tank to extract itself from danger without crew exposure. The Thunderbolt took a more conventional approach, with reinforced towing points and simplified external access to allow rapid recovery by support vehicles. Throughout the tests, Frank noticed Undersecretary Dalton paying particular attention whenever the Phoenix's networked capabilities were demonstrated. His interests seemed technical rather than casual, suggesting knowledge beyond what a typical procurement official might possess. As the day's evaluation concluded, Dalton approached Frank directly. Impressive machines, both of them. Though I must say the Phoenix's approach seems more aligned with where warfare is heading. Each has merits, Frank replied neutrally. The final recommendation will consider multiple factors, not just technological advancement. Of course, Dalton smiled thinly. You mentioned earlier that you're still investigating yesterday's sabotage. Any leads? The direct question about an ongoing security investigation struck Frank as inappropriate. That's a matter for military intelligence, sir. I'm focused on the technical evaluation. Naturally, Dalton checked his watch casually. Perhaps we could discuss this further over dinner. There are aspects of this program with significant political implications that might benefit from your perspective. Frank recognized the invitation for what it was, an attempt to influence the evaluation through unofficial channels. I appreciate the offer, sir, but I have a security briefing scheduled this evening, perhaps another time. Dalton nodded, accepting the deflection without comment. Another time, then. I'll be here through the conclusion of your evaluation. The secretary is quite eager for your final recommendation. After Dalton departed, Frank received an update on the Reeves interrogation. The technician had finally admitted to tampering with the Phoenix, but insisted he had been paid to create a temporary malfunction, not permanent damage. More concerning, he claimed not to know who had hired him. The funds had been transferred anonymously with instructions delivered through encrypted channels. Frank instructed the intelligence officers to continue the interrogation, focusing on identifying any accomplices still at Fort Irwin. The sabotage might have been more extensive than a single compromised technician. As evening approached, Frank made his way to the secure communications room for his scheduled call with General Davis. Before he could reach it, however, he found Victor Kozlov waiting outside his quarters. "A word, Colonel," Kozlov requested, his expression uncharacteristically troubled. Frank gestured him inside, curious about this unexpected approach. Once the door closed, Kozlov spoke with uncharacteristic directness. Undersecretary Dalton's presence concerns me. His support for the Phoenix has always been more political than technical. I believe he has personal interests that extend beyond the program's success. Frank hadn't expected this revelation from the Phoenix's creator. What kind of interests? Financial ones, Kozlov replied bluntly. Dalton has connections to defense contractors that would benefit substantially from the Phoenix's selection. I've always been uncomfortable with his advocacy, but the program needed political support to survive the budget process. Why tell me this now? Frank asked, studying Kozlov carefully. Because yesterday's sabotage changed the equation. I believed in the Phoenix because of its technological superiority, not because of political connections. If Dalton is involved in manipulating this evaluation, Kozlov shook his head in disgust. I want the better design to win, Colonel, even if it's not mine. The statement represented a significant shift in Kozlov's position. Either he was being truthful about his concerns, or he was engaging in an elaborate misdirection. Frank couldn't dismiss either possibility. What do you know about Dalton's interest in Khmer? Frank asked directly. Surprise flickered across Kozlov's face. Khmer? Nothing specific, though. He paused, considering something. Dalton was in the Defense Department during Desert Storm, middle management position in procurement. I believe he had some connection to the Abrams program at that time. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. If Dalton had been involved with the Abrams program during the period when the Khmer incident occurred, he might have direct knowledge of the classified details that had been withheld from the official record. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Frank said. I'll factor it into my ongoing assessment. After Kozlov left, Frank proceeded to the secure communications room, his mind processing the new information. The call with General Davis was brief but productive. Davis confirmed that Undersecretary Dalton's visit had been arranged without his knowledge, suggesting a potential end run around normal chain of command. Be cautious around him, Frank, Davis advised. Dalton has powerful allies in Washington and a reputation for bureaucratic maneuvering. If he's inserted himself into your evaluation, he has an agenda beyond official oversight. I'm beginning to see that, Frank replied. Sir, how much do you know about Dalton's connection to the Abrams program during Desert Storm, specifically any involvement with the Khmer incident? Davis's expression tightened. Dalton was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Army Procurement at that time. He would have seen the classified reports, including details that never made it into the official record. Why do you ask? Because too many threads are connecting back to Khmer, Frank explained. First, Dr. Mitchell's personal connection through her father, then the anonymous message she received referencing the incident. Now Dalton's unexpected appearance and direct mention of Khmer to me personally. Davis fell silent, considering these connections. The investigation into the Khmer incident was handled at the highest levels, Frank. The full truth was deemed too sensitive for public release, not just for military reasons, but for political and industrial ones as well. What aren't you telling me, Bill? Frank pressed. I was there. I lived with the consequences. If Khmer is somehow connected to current events, I need to know everything. Davis sighed heavily. The system failures experienced by your unit weren't random, Frank. They resulted from a fundamental design flaw in a specific batch of Abrams tanks, a flaw that certain officials, possibly including Dalton, may have known about before deployment but failed to address due to production schedules and budget constraints. The revelation struck Frank like a physical blow. For 15 years, he had carried the burden of the decisions made at Khmer, believing he alone bore responsibility for the consequences. Now he was learning that those impossible choices had been forced upon him by bureaucratic negligence. So the 6 men who died under my command might have been victims of procurement failures as much as enemy action or tactical decisions, Davis finished grimly. The investigation was classified at the highest levels precisely to prevent this information from emerging. The political fallout would have been devastating, especially with American tanks being heralded as unbeatable after Desert Storm. Frank absorbed this, decades of guilt and second-guessing suddenly cast in a new light. And Mitchell's father, was he commanding one of those compromised tanks? Yes, though I don't believe Sarah knows that particular detail. Robert Mitchell's tank suffered catastrophic system failure during an engagement near Khmer. Not your engagement specifically, but related operations in the same time frame. The full picture was beginning to emerge. Dalton, as a procurement official potentially implicated in the decision to deploy tanks with known flaws, had a vested interest in keeping the truth about Khmer buried. His sudden appearance at Fort Irwin suggested he feared that truth might emerge during the current evaluation. "Tomorrow is the final day of testing," Frank said. "I'll submit my recommendation afterward. But I need one more thing from you, General. Complete access to the unredacted Khmer files, including the procurement records, showing who knew about the design flaws and when they knew it." Davis hesitated, then nodded. "I'll have them transmitted securely within the hour, but Frank, be careful how you use this information. Dalton has powerful allies. If he believes you're threatening to expose his past involvement—" "I understand the risks," Frank assured him, "but the truth about Khmer is relevant to the current evaluation in ways I'm only beginning to understand." After concluding the call, Frank remained in the secure room, waiting for the promised files. His mind raced with the implications of what he'd learned. The ghosts of Khmer had never been laid to rest, not for the families of the men who died, not for Sarah Mitchell, and certainly not for Frank himself. Now those ghosts threatened to influence the future of American armored warfare through the tangled web of secrets, guilt, and institutional self-protection that had preserved the official narrative for 15 years. The files arrived as promised, delivered through encrypted channels directly to the secure terminal. Frank spent hours reading through the unredacted reports, including technical assessments, procurement decisions, and internal communications that had been withheld from the official investigation. The truth was even worse than Davis had suggested. Senior officials, including Dalton, had received explicit warnings about potential system failures in certain Abrams tanks deployed to Desert Storm. Budget constraints and production schedules had led to a decision to deploy them anyway, with the expectation that they would be rotated out of service after the initial phase of combat operations. That rotation never happened due to the rapid pace of the ground war, leaving compromised vehicles in frontline service during the critical battles, including Khmer. Most damning were the internal memos showing a deliberate decision to classify the technical failures as combat damage in official reports, protecting both careers and contracts from the consequences of deadly miscalculations. By the time Frank finished reading, dawn was approaching. He had not slept, but his mind was clearer than it had been in 15 years. The burden of Khmer remained, but its nature had changed. The impossible choices he had made in combat had been forced upon him by failures far from the battlefield, failures of integrity, courage, and duty among men who had never faced enemy fire, yet consigned others to do so in compromised equipment. As the sun rose over Fort Irwin, Frank prepared for the final day of evaluation with a new sense of purpose. The competing tank designs represented more than different technical approaches. They embodied different ethical frameworks for how America would protect its fighting men and women in future conflicts. The Phoenix, for all its revolutionary technology, followed a philosophy that prioritized performance specifications over human factors, reminiscent of the procurement mindset that had contributed to the Khmer tragedy. The Thunderbolt, with its emphasis on redundancy, survivability, and operator control, represented a different approach, one that acknowledged the inevitable fog of war and designed accordingly. Frank's recommendation would not just select a tank design, it would make a statement about lessons learned or ignored from past failures. And in the process, it might finally bring long-delayed accountability for decisions made 15 years ago that had cost 6 men their lives and haunted countless others ever since. Dawn at Fort Irwin brought a crystalline desert sky, the air still cool before the merciless sun would claim the day. Frank Harrington stood alone on the observation platform, watching as both prototype tanks were prepared for their final evaluation. The Phoenix gleamed in the morning light, its sleek angles designed for stealth and speed. The Thunderbolt presented a more imposing silhouette, its reinforced turret and layered armor speaking to different priorities. Today would determine the future of American armored warfare. But for Frank, something even more significant hung in the balance: the truth about Khmer and the accountability that had been denied for 15 years. After reviewing the classified files throughout the night, Frank had formulated a plan. The final evaluation would include scenarios specifically designed to test the vulnerabilities that had proved fatal at Khmer. He would observe not just how each tank performed, but how their creators responded when pushed to their limits. Character revealed under pressure often told more than technical specifications. "You look like you haven't slept, Colonel." Frank turned to find Sarah Mitchell approaching, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She offered one to him, which he accepted gratefully. I had reading to catch up on, he replied, not specifying the classified Khmer files that had occupied his night. She nodded toward the preparations below. The final test, winner takes the future of American armor. It's not quite that simple, Frank said. My recommendation carries weight, but ultimately the Pentagon will decide based on multiple factors, some of them having nothing to do with battlefield performance. Politics, Sarah said, the word carrying all the distaste of a lifelong engineer confronted with non-technical realities. Politics, economics, industrial capacity, the realities beyond the battlefield that nonetheless shape it. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the technical teams complete final checks on their respective vehicles. Frank studied Sarah's profile, seeing in her features echoes of her father. Robert Mitchell had been a good soldier, a skilled tank commander who had died not because of enemy action, but because of procurement failures and subsequent cover-ups by men like Undersecretary Dalton. I've been thinking about what you said regarding my father, Sarah said eventually, her voice carefully controlled, about telling me the truth once this evaluation is complete. I meant it, Frank assured her. You deserve to know what happened. Whatever it is, I've lived with uncertainty for 15 years. I can wait one more day. She turned to face him directly. But I need to know that your evaluation of the Thunderbolt won't be influenced by any personal connection you might have had with my father. Frank met her gaze steadily. My evaluation will be based solely on which tank will best protect American soldiers in combat, nothing more, nothing less. She studied his face, then nodded, apparently satisfied with what she found there. That's all I ask. The morning briefing brought together both design teams, military evaluators, and Undersecretary Dalton, whose presence continued to cast a shadow over the proceedings. Frank noted how Dalton positioned himself near Kozlov, occasional whispers passing between them during the technical presentations. Today's final evaluation will focus on integrated operations, Frank explained to the assembled group. Both prototypes will face a comprehensive battlefield scenario incorporating all elements tested previously: electronic warfare, drone swarms, top attack munitions, plus conventional armored opposition. He outlined the specifics: a simulated breakthrough operation through defended territory, with both tanks operating independently against a variety of threats. The scenario would test not just combat effectiveness, but command decision-making under stress. Additionally, Frank continued, noting how Dalton leaned forward slightly at this point, I've incorporated a specific system stress test based on historical combat data. Both tanks will experience simulated power fluctuations mimicking those recorded during Operation Desert Storm, specifically at Khmer. The mention of Khmer sent a visible ripple through the room. Sarah Mitchell's eyes widened slightly. Victor Kozlov frowned in concentration. Most tellingly, Undersecretary Dalton's expression froze momentarily before he composed himself. Is that modification really necessary, Colonel? Dalton asked, his tone carefully neutral. The power systems in modern tanks bear little resemblance to those from Desert Storm. On the contrary, Frank replied evenly, the fundamental vulnerabilities remain relevant, particularly in how backup systems engage when primary power fails. Khmer provides valuable historical data on cascading system failures under combat conditions. Dalton didn't argue further, but Frank noted how he immediately sought out Kozlov when the briefing concluded, their conversation intense and private. The evaluation began with the Thunderbolt taking the field first. Frank assumed personal command of the OPFOR forces arrayed against it, directing their movements from the Tactical Operations Center. The scenario unfolded across the vast training area of Fort Irwin, with the Thunderbolt navigating rough terrain while facing a combination of simulated enemy tanks, drone swarms, and electronic warfare. Sarah Mitchell observed from the command center, her expression reflecting every engagement as the Thunderbolt moved steadily through the battlefield. When Frank initiated the power fluctuation sequence, simulating the exact failure pattern from Khmer, she turned to him sharply, recognizing the significance. On screen, the Thunderbolt experienced the cascading power failure, its primary systems going dark momentarily. But unlike the tanks at Khmer, the Thunderbolt's redundant systems engaged smoothly, maintaining critical functions while the crew rapidly implemented recovery procedures. Within 90 seconds, the tank had restored full operational capability and continued its mission. You designed specifically for this failure mode, Frank observed, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Sarah nodded, her eyes still on the screens. My father's last letter mentioned power system concerns. After his death, I made it my mission to understand every recorded failure mode in combat tanks. The Thunderbolt can survive any documented system failure from the past 50 years of armored warfare. The Thunderbolt completed its evaluation run with impressive results. Despite taking simulated hits that would have damaged components, its layered defense approach had protected critical systems and crew compartments. Its weapon systems had remained effective even under electronic attack. Most importantly, when faced with the Khmer failure sequence, it had demonstrated the resilience that had been fatally absent 15 years ago. The Phoenix took the field next, with Kozlov monitoring its performance intently from the command center. Frank noted that Undersecretary Dalton had positioned himself directly behind Kozlov, watching both the screens and the engineers' reactions. Initially, the Phoenix performed brilliantly. Its superior speed and advanced targeting systems allowed it to engage threats at greater distance. Its electronic warfare suite neutralized enemy sensors effectively. Even against drone swarms, its countermeasures proved more effective than in previous tests, suggesting last-minute improvements had been implemented. Then came the Khmer simulation. Frank initiated the power fluctuation sequence, watching carefully as the Phoenix experienced the same cascading failure that had doomed tanks 15 years ago. For several critical seconds, the Phoenix went completely dark, its sophisticated systems reset by the power interruption. When backup systems engaged, they did so unevenly. Weapons came online before sensors, communications restored before navigation. For a full 2 minutes, the Phoenix was effectively combat ineffective, vulnerable to any enemy that might have targeted it during that window. "This is an unrealistic simulation," Kozlov protested, his frustration evident. "The specific power signature you're using wouldn't occur in modern systems." "Are you certain?" Frank challenged quietly. "The fundamental architecture of networked vehicle electronics still requires power distribution nodes. Compromise those nodes, and cascading failure follows the same pattern, regardless of how advanced the connected systems might be." Kozlov had no immediate response, his attention returning to the screens where the Phoenix was gradually restoring functionality. By the time the tank regained full operational capability, it had taken 2 simulated hits that, in actual combat, would have been catastrophic. "You deliberately recreated a specific failure scenario," Dalton said to Frank, his voice low but intense. "One with particular historical significance." "I recreated a realistic combat situation based on documented battlefield experience," Frank replied calmly. "Isn't that precisely what this evaluation should include?" Dalton's eyes narrowed slightly. "We should discuss this privately before you finalize your recommendation, Colonel." "My report will be submitted directly to General Davis," Frank said, "as per my original mandate." The evaluation concluded with both tanks returning to the maintenance area. The data would require hours to analyze fully, but the fundamental differences in philosophy had been starkly demonstrated. The Phoenix excelled when operating under ideal conditions, but degraded catastrophically when those conditions were compromised. The Thunderbolt sacrificed peak performance for consistent resilience, maintaining combat effectiveness even when primary systems failed. Frank scheduled the final debriefing for late afternoon, allowing both teams time to review the data and prepare their closing arguments. In the interim, he retreated to the secure communications room to update General Davis on the evaluation results and the increasingly concerning behavior of Undersecretary Dalton. "He's clearly attempting to influence the outcome," Frank reported, "and his reaction to the Khmer simulation confirms he recognizes its significance." Davis nodded gravely. "The unredacted files you reviewed last night implicate Dalton directly in the decision to deploy compromised tanks despite known vulnerabilities. If that connection became public now, especially in the context of a multi-billion-dollar procurement decision, his career would be over," Frank finished, "and possibly worse, given that his negligence contributed to military casualties." "Precisely, which makes him dangerous, Frank. Be extremely careful in how you proceed." After concluding the call, Frank was not surprised to find Dalton waiting outside the secure room, his practiced smile failing to conceal the tension in his posture. "Colonel Harrington, I believe we need to have a frank discussion about the Khmer incident and its relevance to the current evaluation." Frank regarded him steadily. "My office would be more appropriate for that conversation, Mr. Undersecretary." Once inside the privacy of his temporary office, Frank closed the door and turned to face Dalton directly. "You wanted to discuss Khmer." Dalton abandoned pretense, his expression hardening. You access the unredacted files. You know my role in the procurement process during Desert Storm. I know you were aware of potential system vulnerabilities in the Abrams tanks deployed to certain units, including those at Comir. I know those vulnerabilities were deemed acceptable risks due to budget and schedule constraints. It was wartime, Dalton said defensively. Difficult decisions had to be made. No weapon system is without risk. 6 men died because of those difficult decisions, Frank replied, his voice remaining measured despite the anger he felt. 6 men under my command who trusted that their equipment wouldn't fail them in combat. Dalton's expression shifted to one of calculation. Ancient history, Colonel. What matters now is the future of American armored warfare. The Phoenix represents a quantum leap forward, one that would secure technological superiority for decades. Even though it demonstrated the same vulnerability to cascading power failure that killed those men at Comir, that can be addressed in production models, Dalton insisted. The point is that your evaluation should focus on capabilities, not historical grudges. Frank studied the man before him, seeing the bureaucratic survivor who had navigated the Pentagon for decades, his career advancing while others paid the price for his decisions. My evaluation will be based on which tank will best protect American soldiers in combat, Frank said, echoing his earlier words to Sarah Mitchell. Nothing more, nothing less. Then we understand each other, Dalton said, his tone suggesting the opposite. I would hate to see your distinguished career end with questions about your objectivity, especially given your personal connection to Comir. The threat was thinly veiled. If Frank's recommendation didn't favor the Phoenix, Dalton would use his influence to challenge the evaluation's integrity, possibly exposing Frank's own classified actions at Comir in the process. My report will reflect my professional assessment, Frank said simply. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for the final debriefing. Dalton departed with a knowing smile that suggested he believed his intimidation had been effective. He didn't understand the man he was dealing with. Frank Harrington had faced down Iraqi tanks at point-blank range. Bureaucratic threats held little power over someone who had already confronted his deepest fears and regrets. The final debriefing brought both teams together for closing arguments. Viktor Kozlov presented first, emphasizing the Phoenix's revolutionary capabilities and dismissing the power failure simulation as an artificial scenario unlikely to occur in actual combat. His confidence seemed partly restored, perhaps bolstered by whatever assurances Dalton had provided. Sarah Mitchell followed with a measured assessment of the Thunderbolt's performance, focusing not on peak capabilities but on consistent effectiveness under varied conditions. She emphasized crew survivability and system resilience, directly addressing the lessons learned from historical failures including, without explicitly naming it, Comir. As the presentations concluded, Frank addressed both teams. You've both created exceptional machines, each reflecting a different philosophy of armored warfare. My recommendation will be submitted to General Davis tomorrow morning. That recommendation will consider not just performance metrics, but the fundamental question of which approach best serves the soldiers who will risk their lives inside these tanks. The formalities complete, Frank found himself approached by Kozlov as the room cleared. The engineer's expression was troubled. His earlier confidence apparently faded. Dalton spoke with you, Kozlov stated, not a question, but an observation. He did, Frank confirmed. Whatever he threatened or promised, you should know that it doesn't represent my position, Kozlov said, surprising Frank with his directness. I believe in the Phoenix's technical superiority, but I've never condoned political manipulation of military procurement. Frank studied the man who had been his rival for decades, sensing a genuine ethical line Kozlov was unwilling to cross despite his ambition. Noted, he replied simply. As evening fell over Fort Irwin, Frank made his way toward his quarters, his mind already composing the recommendation he would submit tomorrow. The technical evaluation had provided clear data. The ethical implications were equally clear. The only question remaining was how directly to address the Comir connection in his official report. He found Sarah Mitchell waiting outside his quarters, her expression reflecting the emotional weight of the moment. Tomorrow this ends, she said, one way or another. The evaluation, yes, Frank agreed. But some things continue regardless of which tank is selected. Like the truth about my father. She met his gaze directly. I don't want to wait until tomorrow, Colonel. I've waited 15 years. I need to know now. Frank considered her request, weighing his obligation to maintain classified information against her, right to know what had happened to her father. She had earned the truth through her own service to the country, creating a tank specifically designed to prevent the same tragedy from recurring. "Come inside," he said, opening the door to his quarters. "This isn't a conversation for hallways." Once they were seated, Frank gathered his thoughts, determining how much he could share without violating his security clearance. "Your father was commanding an Abrams tank during operations near Kamir. His unit encountered enemy armor and engaged effectively, but during the battle, his tank experienced catastrophic system failure." Sarah nodded, these basic facts already known to her. The official report called it a combat-related vehicle malfunction. What the report didn't say, Frank continued carefully, was that the malfunction resulted from a known vulnerability in power distribution systems used in a specific production batch of Abrams tanks. A vulnerability that had been identified during testing but deemed an acceptable risk due to budget and time constraints. Sarah's expression registered shock, then deepening anger. "Are you saying they knew? They knew the tanks could fail that way and they sent them into combat anyway?" "Certain officials in the procurement chain were aware of the risk, yes. Your father's death wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of decisions made far from the battlefield by men who never had to face the consequences of those decisions." She absorbed this, years of uncertainty crystallizing into focused rage. And one of those men was Undersecretary Dalton. Frank neither confirmed nor denied, though his silence was answer enough. "What matters is that your father died not because of enemy action or his own actions, but because his equipment failed him when he needed it most." "And the Thunderbolt?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with emotion. "Everything I designed into it addresses exactly the vulnerabilities that cost your father his life," Frank finished. "Perhaps without knowing the specific details, you nonetheless created a tank that would have saved him that day." Tears gathered in her eyes, though her composure remained intact. "All these years, I've been trying to protect other daughters from getting the same letter I received, without even knowing exactly what I was protecting them from." "Your father would be proud," Frank said simply, "not just of the tank you've created, but of the engineer and person you've become." She wiped away a tear, straightening her shoulders. "What happens now with Dalton, I mean, if he was involved in covering up the real reason for these deaths?" "Justice is rarely simple or swift," Frank cautioned, "especially when it involves high-ranking officials. But truth has a way of emerging eventually." After Sarah departed, Frank spent hours writing his final recommendation, carefully balancing technical assessment with the ethical dimensions that had emerged throughout the evaluation. By midnight, the report was complete, a comprehensive analysis that left no doubt as to which tank should become America's next generation of armored warfare. Before sending it, Frank added one final section addressing the Kamir connection directly. He named no names but made clear that the vulnerabilities demonstrated during the evaluation had historical precedent with deadly consequences. The message between the lines would be clear enough to those who needed to understand it. As he prepared to transmit the report, a knock at his door interrupted the late-night silence. Opening it, he was surprised to find Viktor Kozlov standing there, his expression grave. "We need to talk," Kozlov said without preamble. "It's about Dalton and Kamir." Chapter 9. The Steel Legacy. Frank studied Kozlov's face, noting the unusual tension there. After a moment's consideration, he stepped aside, allowing the engineer to enter. "It's late for professional courtesy calls," Frank observed, closing the door. "This isn't professional courtesy," Kozlov replied, remaining standing despite Frank's gesture toward a chair. "This is about preventing history from repeating itself." Frank's interest sharpened. "Explain." "Dalton approached me after the debriefing. He was disturbing, insistent that the Phoenix would be selected regardless of your recommendation. He implied that steps had been taken to ensure this outcome." "What kind of steps?" Kozlov shook his head. He wouldn't elaborate, but his confidence was absolute, and he expected me to be pleased by this assurance. I was not. Frank considered this information, mentally calculating its implications. "Why come to me with this? The Phoenix is your creation. Its selection would be your triumph." "Because I've spent my career pursuing technological superiority, not political manipulation," Kozlov replied, with unexpected passion. "And because Dalton's fixation on Kamir disturbs me, he spoke of it as unfinished business that would finally be resolved." A cold certainty settled in Frank's mind. Dalton wasn't just trying to protect his career by ensuring the Phoenix's selection. He was attempting to bury the Kamir incident permanently by discrediting the very design philosophy that had exposed its lessons. Did Dalton mention specific actions, timelines? Only that by morning the matter would be settled conclusively. His words, not mine. Frank moved to his computer, where his completed recommendation waited for transmission. I was about to submit my final report. If Dalton has some plan to undermine or preempt it, you should expedite your submission, Kozlov suggested, and perhaps alert General Davis to Dalton's behavior. Frank nodded, turning back to Kozlov with newfound respect. Despite their decades of professional rivalry, the engineer had chosen integrity over advantage. Thank you for coming forward. It couldn't have been an easy decision. Kozlov's expression remained serious. I've spent my career advocating for technology as a solution to battlefield challenges, but I've never forgotten that human decisions ultimately determine success or failure. At Khmer, technology failed those soldiers, but from what I've learned, human decisions failed them first. A surprisingly philosophical assessment from a man who once accused me of sabotaging his targeting system, Frank noted with the ghost of a smile. Kozlov actually chuckled, the tension momentarily broken. We were younger men then. Perhaps wisdom comes with age, even to stubborn engineers. After Kozlov departed, Frank immediately contacted General Davis via secure line, briefing him on the concerning development. Davis promised to have security increased around both prototypes and to monitor Dalton's communications. Submit your report now, Davis instructed. I'll personally ensure it reaches the appropriate decision makers before Dalton can interfere. Frank transmitted the completed recommendation, including the section addressing the Khmer connection. With that done, he considered his next steps. If Dalton truly had some plan to conclusively settle the matter by morning, mere vigilance might not be sufficient. Acting on instinct honed through decades of military service, Frank decided to conduct his own nighttime inspection of both prototypes. He contacted Captain Reynolds, arranging for access to the secure maintenance facility where the tanks were stored. The cavernous building was dimly lit at night, the two prototype tanks positioned at opposite ends like sleeping titans. Security guards acknowledged Frank with respectful nods as he entered, his rank and role granting him automatic access despite the late hour. He approached the Thunderbolt first, circling it slowly, examining its battle-scarred exterior from the day's evaluation. Even at rest, the machine projected a sense of solid reliability, its design philosophy evident in every contour and component. Moving to the Phoenix, Frank conducted the same careful inspection. The sleeker tank had also sustained simulated damage during testing, though its advanced self-diagnostic systems had already cataloged the affected components for repair. As he completed his circuit of the Phoenix, Frank noticed something unexpected. A maintenance panel on the rear hull left slightly ajar. Standard security protocols required all access points to be sealed when work was not actively being performed. Concerned, Frank examined the panel more closely. It appeared to have been recently opened, the securing bolts not fully tightened. This deviation from procedure, combined with Kozlov's warning about Dalton, raised immediate alarms. Frank summoned the senior security officer, instructing him to initiate a complete inspection of both tanks for any unauthorized modifications or tampering. As the maintenance crews were assembled for this unscheduled midnight inspection, Frank contacted military intelligence to request additional support. The inspection of the Thunderbolt revealed nothing unusual, but when technicians opened the suspicious panel on the Phoenix, they discovered a small electronic device attached to the main power distribution node, exactly the component that had failed during the Khmer simulation. "What is it?" Frank asked the lead technician, who was carefully examining the device without removing it. "Some kind of remote trigger," the technician replied, his expression concerned, "designed to induce a power surge through the main distribution node when activated. It would cause catastrophic failure of all primary systems." The implications were immediately clear. Someone had sabotaged the Phoenix to fail spectacularly during its next operation, likely during the final demonstration scheduled for visiting Pentagon officials tomorrow. Such a failure, coming after Frank's evaluation, had specifically tested for power resilience, would devastate the Phoenix's prospects regardless of which prototype he had recommended. "Secure the device as evidence," Frank instructed. "I want a full forensic analysis, and I want to know who had access to this area in the last 24 hours. As the technical team worked to safely remove and preserve the sabotage device, Frank stepped outside to brief General Davis on the discovery. Davis's response was immediate and decisive. "I'm dispatching military police to detain Undersecretary Dalton for questioning. This goes beyond procurement politics. This is potential treason. Frank returned to observe the continued inspection, his mind racing through possible scenarios. The sabotage made no sense if attributed to Dalton, who had been advocating for the Phoenix's selection. Unless, the realization struck Frank with sudden clarity. Dalton's goal wasn't to promote one tank over the other. His objective was to discredit the entire evaluation process, forcing a restart that would delay any decision and provide time to bury the Khmer connection permanently. By sabotaging the Phoenix to fail catastrophically, he would create confusion and suspicion that would taint both prototypes and everyone involved in their assessment. As dawn approached, military police reported that Dalton was nowhere to be found. His quarters were empty, his government vehicle missing from its assigned parking space. An unauthorized departure from a secure military installation during an active evaluation represented a serious security breach, elevating concerns about his intentions and actions. Frank ordered both prototypes placed under continuous guard with no maintenance access permitted without his direct authorization. Whatever Dalton had planned, it would not involve further tampering with the vehicles themselves. By sunrise, the base was on heightened alert. Security checkpoints verified the identity of all personnel, and the scheduled demonstrations for visiting officials had been postponed pending the investigation. Frank met with Sarah Mitchell and Victor Kozlov separately, briefing them on the sabotage without revealing all details of the ongoing security operation. Someone wanted the Phoenix to fail catastrophically, Kozlov said, his expression darkening as he absorbed the implications. Not just to lose the competition, but to be destroyed in a way that would discredit its entire design approach. That's our assessment, Frank confirmed. The device was sophisticated, designed to mimic a cascade failure similar to what occurred at Khmer. Kozlov's eyes widened with understanding. To bury the truth about those original failures by creating a new, more public failure that would dominate the narrative. Precisely. Sarah Mitchell received the news of the sabotage with equal gravity, immediately recognizing its connection to the revelations about her father's death. This isn't just about tanks anymore, is it? This is about covering up past decisions and preventing accountability. It appears so, Frank agreed. The truth about Khmer threatens certain careers and reputations. Powerful people prefer it remain buried. By mid-morning, military police had located Dalton's abandoned vehicle near the main gate, suggesting he had arranged alternative transportation off base. A base-wide search had found no trace of him, and intelligence agencies had been alerted to watch for any attempt to leave the country. Frank returned to the secure communications room for an update from General Davis, who had been coordinating the response from Washington. "We've uncovered some disturbing financial transactions," Davis reported. "Dalton has been moving substantial funds to offshore accounts over the past month. He appears to have been preparing for this moment for some time. This goes beyond protecting his reputation from the Khmer revelations," Frank observed. "This level of preparation suggests a deeper involvement. We're investigating possible connections to foreign interests," Davis confirmed. "The sabotage device contains components consistent with Russian electronic warfare systems, similar to what was used to disable the Phoenix during your initial evaluation." The pieces were falling into place. Dalton's corruption extended beyond covering up past negligence. He had likely been compromised by foreign intelligence, using his position to influence American military procurement for years. "Your recommendation has been received and processed," Davis added. "The evaluation results are now official, regardless of Dalton's attempts to disrupt the process." "And your decision based on my recommendation?" Frank asked. "The Thunderbolt has been selected as America's next-generation main battle tank," Davis confirmed. "Production will begin within 6 months, with initial deployment scheduled for next year." Frank nodded, a sense of professional satisfaction tempering the gravity of the security situation. The better tank had been selected, not just on technical merits, but on the philosophy that prioritized crew survival and system resilience over theoretical peak performance. As Frank exited the communications room, he found Sarah Mitchell waiting outside, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "They're saying Dalton has fled the base," she said without preamble, "that he might have been working for foreign interests." "The investigation is ongoing," Frank replied cautiously. "But yes, that's the current theory." "This is about more than tanks," she stated, echoing her earlier observation. "This is about justice for my father and the others who died at Khmer." Frank recognized the resolve in her eyes. The same determination that had driven her to create a tank specifically designed to prevent the failures that had cost her father his life. Justice takes many forms, he said carefully. Sometimes it's not about punishment, but about ensuring the same mistakes aren't repeated. The Thunderbolt was selected, wasn't it? She asked, reading something in his expression. He nodded, seeing no reason to withhold information that would soon be public. Your design will protect the next generation of American tank crews. Your father would be proud. Tears gathered briefly in her eyes before she blinked them away, professional composure reasserting itself. Thank you, Colonel. Not just for the selection, but for the truth. After 15 years, the truth matters more than I can express. As the day progressed, the search for Dalton continued without success. Intelligence reports suggested he might have fled to a non-extradition country, using prepared identities and resources accumulated over years of corruption. The investigation had expanded to review every major procurement decision he had influenced during his Pentagon career, with preliminary findings suggesting a pattern of compromised judgments benefiting foreign interests. Frank spent the afternoon completing his final reports on the evaluation, knowing they would become part of the historical record and potentially evidence in future legal proceedings against Dalton. He took particular care with the section addressing the Khmer connection, ensuring that the truth was documented clearly while respecting the classified nature of certain details. As evening approached, Frank found Viktor Kozlov in the maintenance bay, supervising the removal of the sabotage device from the Phoenix. The engineer's expression was somber as he watched technicians carefully disconnect the foreign technology from his creation. 20 years of work, Kozlov said quietly as Frank approached, all potentially undermined by one man's corruption. The Phoenix is still an extraordinary machine, Frank offered. The selection of the Thunderbolt doesn't negate your achievements. Kozlov nodded, accepting the professional courtesy. Perhaps in time, elements of the Phoenix's approach will be incorporated into future designs. Technology advances through both success and failure. A surprisingly philosophical perspective from a man who once viewed tank design as pure engineering, Frank observed. Kozlov smiled faintly. As I said before, perhaps wisdom comes with age. Or perhaps recent events have provided a valuable reminder that tanks are ultimately tools for human purposes, subject to human virtues and failings alike. Their conversation was interrupted by Captain Reynolds, approaching with urgent news. Sir, they've found Undersecretary Dalton. Military police intercepted him attempting to cross into Mexico at a remote location. He's being transported to Washington under heavy guard. Frank absorbed this development with grim satisfaction. Dalton would face justice for his actions, both recent and long past. The truth about Khmer would finally emerge, bringing closure to families who had lost loved ones and accountability to those whose decisions had contributed to those losses. Will you testify about Khmer if needed? Kozlov asked after Reynolds departed. Without hesitation, Frank replied. 15 years is too long for truth to remain buried. The next morning brought clear desert skies as Frank prepared to depart Fort Irwin, his evaluation mission complete. The competing tanks stood side by side in the morning light, their future roles now defined. The Thunderbolt would enter production as America's next-generation main battle tank, while the Phoenix would continue as a research platform, its innovative technologies potentially incorporated into future designs. Sarah Mitchell found him as he was loading his bag into the waiting staff car. Heading back to your farm, Colonel. Back to my tractors and cornfields, he confirmed with a faint smile. Though I expect I'll be called to Washington for the investigation into Dalton. Will the truth about Khmer become public? She asked. Parts of it will remain classified for valid security reasons, Frank replied honestly. But the essential truth, the chain of decisions that led to those failures and the men who made them, will be documented and acknowledged. She nodded, seeming satisfied with this assurance. My father used to say that tanks aren't just weapons, they're promises. Promises to the crews who serve in them that we've done everything possible to bring them home alive. A wise perspective, Frank acknowledged, and one that guided your design philosophy for the Thunderbolt. Just as it will guide my work on the next generation, she said with quiet determination. The Thunderbolt is just the beginning. As they shook hands in farewell, Frank felt a sense of completion that had eluded him for 15 years. The ghosts of Khmer would never fully disappear, but they had found a measure of peace through truth finally acknowledged and lessons finally learned. The drive from Fort Irwin took him through the vast Mojave Desert, the landscape harsh but beautiful in its stark simplicity. Frank watched the terrain pass, his thoughts transitioning from the complexities of military technology to the simpler rhythms of his farm. He had done what he came to do, evaluated two visions for the future of American armored warfare, and selected the one that best served the soldiers who would risk their lives inside these machines. In the process, he had helped expose long-buried truths and bring accountability to decisions made far from the battlefield, but felt acutely by those who fought there. As the desert gave way to more verdant landscapes, Frank's thoughts turned to the corn waiting to be harvested, the fences needing repair, the ancient tractor still sitting half disassembled in his barn. The transition from Colonel Harrington back to Farmer Frank would take time, just as it had 15 years ago when he first left the service. But this time the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The burden of Khmer had been shared, its lessons incorporated into steel and technology that would protect future generations of soldiers. His part in that story was complete. The farm appeared on the horizon, its familiar silhouette against the setting sun welcoming him home. As the car pulled into the long driveway, Frank saw his neighbor Jim standing beside the porch, having kept watch over the property during his absence. "Everything went all right at that Pentagon thing?" Jim asked as Frank retrieved his bag from the car. Frank considered the question, the complexities of the past month condensing into simple truth. "Yeah, Jim, everything went just fine." His gaze drifted to the barn where his father's old tractor waited, a far simpler machine than the tanks he had just evaluated, but no less meaningful. Machines, whether farm equipment or military vehicles, were ultimately defined by the purposes they served and the values of those who created them. The Thunderbolt would serve its purpose well, protecting American soldiers in conflicts yet to come. Frank Harrington had served his purpose too, bringing experience and integrity to a decision with far-reaching consequences. Now, as sunset painted the farmhouse in hues of gold, it was time to return to simpler machines and simpler truths. The ghosts of Khmer would never completely fade, but they had found a measure of peace, their sacrifices honored in the steel and fire of America's next generation of armored warfare. Frank Harrington, once called Iron Thunder for his unflinching command in battle, lifted his bag and walked toward his home, leaving the thunder behind, but carrying with him the satisfaction of duty fulfilled and truth finally served.